Gettysburg, the turning point that changed everything. July 1st Street, 1863, a small town in Pennsylvania. Quiet, peaceful, until fate stumbled into it like a soldier lost in fog. A Southern scouting unit clashed with Union cavalry just outside Gettysburg. What followed was not part of any grand plan. But 3 days later, over 50,000 men would lie dead, wounded, or missing, and the course of American history would never be the same. But here's the twist nobody tells you. Gettysburg almost didn't happen. What if General Lee hadn't marched north? What if this whole bloodbath was just a consequence of ego, chance, and one fateful decision? Stay with me to the end, because what you're about to hear might just make you question everything you thought you knew about the Civil War. And if you're into real history, not the textbook version, hit that subscribe button. This is just the beginning. Historical context: a whisper before the storm. Before the thunder of cannons echoed across the rolling hills of Gettysburg, before the grass drank the blood of 50,000 men, there was silence, and in that silence, plans were drawn, destinies were rewritten, and a marble legend made his most dangerous move yet. Let's rewind. Spring 1863, Virginia. The war had dragged on for 2 brutal years. By now, Americans weren't just fighting each other. They were burying brothers, sons, neighbors. The North had more factories, more soldiers, more money, but the South had Robert E. Lee. The Southern Star rises. Lee wasn't just a general. To the Confederate people, he was a knight of the old code. Stoic, noble, untouched by scandal, seemingly untouched by failure. They called him the Marble Man. Cold, perfect, untouchable. And for a while, it felt true. In early May 1863, Lee delivered what some historians still call his military masterpiece. The Battle of Chancellorsville. He was outnumbered 2-1. The Union had 130,000 men under General Joseph Hooker. Lee had barely 60,000. That's not a fair fight. That's a slaughter waiting to happen. But Lee didn't care. The gambler in gray. He split his forces, a military sin in most playbooks. Then he split him again. And then once more. What looked like insanity became genius. He sent Stonewall Jackson, his right hand, his hammer, around Hooker's right flank. Jackson's night march was like a ghost gliding through the trees. By the time Union soldiers realized what was happening, they were being shot in the back, from the woods. Chaos, terror, a Union rout. Hooker, stunned, did nothing. He was replaced not long after. Lee had just won his most glorious victory. But hidden beneath that glory was a wound. Stonewall Jackson, the one man who could translate Lee's orders into lightning, was accidentally shot by his own troops. And 3 days later, he died. The South celebrated, but their sword had been broken. Lee wept, and the road to Gettysburg was paved, not with confidence, but with quiet desperation. The dilemma. Now, Lee faced a choice. He could dig in, defend Virginia, and pray the North would grow tired. Or he could strike hard, bold, northward. The best defense, Lee said, is a good offense. The logic of madness. Let's break it down. The Confederacy was bleeding. Men, supplies, food, all running low. Virginia's farmlands were trampled. Cities were starving. Boots were falling apart. Some soldiers marched barefoot. The Union blockade was squeezing the South like a python. So Lee thought, why fight on Southern soil? Let's make the North feel what we feel. The real targets, Lincoln's mind and Europe's gaze. Lee wasn't just chasing a tactical victory. He was going for psychological war. If he could win on Northern soil, morale in the North might collapse. The public might pressure Lincoln to make peace. The 1864 elections were coming. A peace candidate could rise. And maybe, just maybe, Britain or France would finally say, let's recognize the Confederacy. That's the real twist. Gettysburg wasn't just about guns. It was about narratives. Lee didn't just want to beat the Union. He wanted to delegitimize it. The invasion begins. So in June 1863, Lee moved. He took his army of Northern Virginia, 75,000 strong, and crossed the Potomac. This wasn't a raid. This was the Confederacy's Hail Mary. Lee's army entered Pennsylvania, not like an army of conquest, but like a parade of ghosts. "We're here for the shoes," one Confederate soldier joked. "We're not invading Pennsylvania. We're just shopping, and Gettysburg has good shoes." It was half true. Many of them had no footwear at all. Meanwhile, in the Union, President Lincoln had fired more generals than a moody CEO. McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, each had failed, either through caution, incompetence, or massive mustaches. Now he turned to a quiet, methodical man, George Gordon Meade. Meade wasn't flashy. He wasn't even fully unpacked when he took command. And yet, in just 3 days, he would face the greatest challenge of his life. Gettysburg wasn't the plan. Here's where things get weird. Lee never meant to fight at Gettysburg. It was a small town, barely on the map. He was aiming for Harrisburg, maybe even Philadelphia. But then, as always in war, chaos struck. The cavalry that vanished. Lee's eyes and ears. General J.E.B. Stuart, the Confederate cavalry commander, had gone off on a joyride. Literally, he disappeared for weeks, circling around the Union Army, making headlines, raiding trains, but sending no intel back. Lee was flying blind. By the time his forces started converging near Gettysburg, Union troops were already there, by accident. A small clash on July 1st became something no one intended. The greatest battle ever fought on American soil. The clock is ticking. So to recap, the South is desperate. Lee has just lost his most trusted general. His cavalry is MIA. He's marching into enemy territory blind. And yet, he's betting everything on one knockout blow. That's not just strategy, that's ambition flirting with madness. And what happens next is the difference between a legend and a catastrophe. But let's zoom out. This isn't just a story about two armies clashing. This is about America itself, on the edge of a knife. Had Lee won at Gettysburg, would the Union have fractured permanently? Would slavery have remained for another century? Would America ever have become America? One decision, one town, one man, Robert E. Lee, carving his name into history with blood. And yes, it's true. The battle that changed America started over shoes. Union General Buford's cavalry rode into Gettysburg to scout and maybe grab supplies. Confederates arrived for the same reason. They collided, then more troops arrived, then even more, until suddenly, 160,000 men were locked in mortal combat over a town neither side really cared about. It's like two people arguing in Walmart over the last size 10 sneaker and accidentally starting World War III. And so it begins. Lee set his pieces on the board. Meade moved fast. The trap was sprung. And the town of Gettysburg, a name no one had cared about, would become immortal. In our next segment, we enter day one of battle. The cavalry clash, the terrain that shaped fate, and the first blood of a storm no one could stop. Hit that subscribe, because now the story truly begins. You've heard the textbook version. Names, dates, outcomes. But history, real history, doesn't live in timelines. It breathes through the people who were there, and those brave enough to write it honestly. That's why this story is rooted in 3 pillars. Stephen W. Sears, Gettysburg, a surgical breakdown of every command. Misstep and Miracle, team of rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin, giving us the Lincoln behind the legend. And Michael Shara's The Killer Angels, not just a novel, but a raw, Pulitzer-winning dive into the minds of generals and grunts alike. These aren't just books, they're blueprints of the battle, with all the fear, doubt, and fire left intact. Also used in Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, The Gold Standard. Day 1, Part 1. The town no one planned to die in. July 1st Street, 1863. Dawn. Gettysburg wakes slowly. Just another summer morning. A sleepy crossroads town of 2.400 people, surrounded by rolling hills, orchards, and old wagon trails, church bells, morning bread. A farmer walks past the cemetery on the hill, grumbling about the heat. Nobody knows that by nightfall, this town will be soaked in blood, and by the end of 3 days, over 50.00 men will be dead, dying, or vanished into the Pennsylvania dust. But let's start with something simpler. Shoes. Yes, this war-shifting battle may have started over shoes. General A.P. Hill, Confederate, was told Gettysburg had a stockpile. His men were worn out, marching barefoot for weeks, so he sent a small division ahead, not to start a battle, just to check. But fate doesn't care about intentions. Waiting near Gettysburg was a man named John Buford, Union general, cavalryman, and one of the most underrated heroes of the entire war. Buford had arrived the day before with about 2.70 cavalrymen. He wasn't here to fight, not yet. He was here to buy time, to watch, to delay, to give the main Union force, still miles behind, a chance to arrive. But when A.P. Hill's division approached from the west, the chessboard flipped. What happened next was improvisation, instinct, and pure courage. It was two men, Buford and Hill, stumbling into each other like boxes in a dark alley. But here's the twist. Neither one wanted this fight. Hill was looking for shoes. Buford was just watching the roads. And yet, within hours, their encounter would ignite one of the most consequential battles in American history. Because this wasn't just a clash of soldiers, it was a clash of decisions. And the first belonged to Buford. He looked at the terrain. He saw the ridges behind him, Seminary Ridge, Cemetery Hill. He understood what few men could. If we don't hold these ridges today, we lose the war tomorrow. So he did something mad. He ordered his cavalry, not trained for long defense, to dig in, stand firm, and hold off an entire Confederate division, outnumbered nearly 4-1, against veteran Southern troops, on open ground. But Buford knew the Union infantry was coming, and all he had to do was hold. Just hold. It was a gamble, but sometimes history changes in the space between two breaths. As the sun rose over the Pennsylvania fields, the first shots rang out. Not volleys, not cannon, just the crack of rifles, like distant woodpeckers. A patrol, skirmishes, two soldiers spotting each other across a fence post and raising their weapons at the same time. A.P. Hill's men weren't expecting resistance, but they got it. Buford's cavalry dug in along McPherson's Ridge, returned fire with startling discipline. And suddenly, this wasn't a shoe mission anymore. This was a fight. Back in Confederate lines, Hill realized he had walked straight into a hornet's nest. And back in the Union lines, Buford scanned the horizon. He was buying time, but for who? That's when the second twist arrived. From the south, marching hard, came General John Reynolds, leading the First Corps of the Union Army. Reynolds was one of the most respected officers in the North. He had a sharp eye, a calm demeanor, and the rare gift of inspiring men before the first shot. He arrived, saw Buford still holding the ridges, and instantly knew, we fight here. Reynolds didn't hesitate. He ordered his infantry into line, and in doing so, committed the Union Army to battle. Think about that. In a war filled with caution, politics, and second-guessing, Reynolds did something radical. He trusted the terrain, he trusted Buford, and he trusted the moment. But as the first brigades moved forward, something happened that would change the tone of the entire day. A Confederate bullet struck Reynolds right in the neck. He died instantly. No last words, no heroic charge, just silence and collapse. One of the Union's best was gone in seconds. The irony, Reynolds had just made the bravest decision of his life and never lived to see it play out. Word of his death spread like lightning, but his orders stood. The Union was staying. Meanwhile, Lee, the Southern commander, was still miles away. He hadn't expected a fight here. His army was strung out across the countryside. No one had scouted the terrain. No one had drawn up battle lines. And yet, now he had no choice. The war had come to Gettysburg, and he had to decide, commit or retreat. Lee chose to commit. It would be one of the most fateful decisions of his career. By late morning, the fields west of Gettysburg were filled with smoke, shouts, and bodies. Farmers hid in their basements. Children cried in schoolhouses. The town became a funnel, a place neither army had intended to fight and now couldn't escape. As more Confederate divisions arrived, the pressure on Union lines increased. Buford's cavalry, nearly spent, withdrew to the rear. The fresh Union infantry, under General Abner Doubleday, took over. Yes, that Doubleday, the one who gets, wrongly, credited for inventing baseball. He wasn't a baseball player here. He was a general, fighting for his life, and the Confederates kept coming. By afternoon, Lee's army was nearly fully engaged. General Ewell attacked from the north. General Rhodes swept in from the northwest. General Early looped from the northeast. It was a three-pronged attack, a vice closing around the Union. Union lines bent and finally broke. They retreated through the town, chaos erupting in every alley. But then, salvation, Cemetery Hill, high ground south of town. It had been identified early by Buford. Reynolds had ordered it held. And now, Union troops rallied there, anchoring the defense. By nightfall, the Union still held the hill, exhausted, bloodied, but alive. And the Confederates, they stood just yards away, waiting. One final twist, General Ewell, tasked with taking the hill, if practicable, hesitated. He thought his men were too tired, the terrain too uncertain. He didn't attack. That one moment, that one hesitation, would haunt the Confederacy forever. Because had he charged, had he seized the hill, the entire Union line might have collapsed. Instead, the North held, and history shifted. Day one was over, but the real storm was only just beginning. Stay tuned for part 2. Day 1, part 2. Holding the line, bleeding for the hill. Night approaches. The sun dips behind Seminary Ridge, casting long shadows across the fields now littered with bodies. The smell of gunpowder lingers in the humid air. Smoke clings to broken fences. A horse, panicked and riderless, gallops past a wagon overturned in the mud. The Battle of Gettysburg, Day 1, is supposed to be winding down. But war, real war, doesn't follow the clock. It follows momentum, and momentum is a liar. Let's step back. By the late afternoon of July 1st, 1863, the Union Army has been pushed back through the streets of Gettysburg. Block by block, house by house, civilians barricade windows. One woman hides under her stairs with a newborn, counting every cannon blast like a second heartbeat. Another leaves her laundry mid-hang and never returns home. The Union retreat is frantic, but not disorganized. They fall back, not because they're routed, but because they're outflanked. The line was bent, then cracked. Now, all hope lies on a patch of high ground south of town. Cemetery Hill. It's not just a hill. It's a fortress of earth and advantage. And Union generals know, if they lose this ground tonight, there will be no Day 2. But here's the dramatic twist. The Confederates could have taken it. They were closer. They had momentum. Union forces were reeling. So what happened? Let's zoom in. General Richard S. Ewell, commanding the Confederate Second Corps, receives Lee's fateful order. Take the hill, if practicable. 3 words. 3 devastatingly vague words. Ewell is no Stonewall Jackson. He's brave, yes. Experienced, yes. But he's cautious, methodical. And now, after a full day's fighting, his men are exhausted. He rides to a promontory, looks through his field glass at Cemetery Hill. Union reinforcements are visible. Digging in, artillery is being placed. The sun is setting, and Ewell hesitates. Just for a moment, he decides it isn't practicable. And just like that, the hill is spared. It may be the single most consequential non-decision of the war. Because the next morning, Cemetery Hill will bristle with Union cannon, a bastion, an anchor. The opportunity is gone. Back in Confederate headquarters, Lee receives the news. No attack. He says nothing. No rage. No praise. Just silence. But inside, the seeds of doubt are sown. Was he too vague? Was Ewell too timid? Would Stonewall, had he lived, have charged up that hill like a thunderstorm on horseback? No one says it aloud, but everyone thinks it. Meanwhile, back on the Union side, something strange happens. They stop retreating. They start building. Infantry digs trenches with bayonets and spoons. Artillerymen roll the guns into place, barking orders in a dozen different dialects. The 11th Corps, once shattered, regroups. The 1st Corps, bleeding, battered, refuses to break. And then comes a moment of raw humanity. A Union drummer boy, no older than 13, plays a slow march along the ridge. Not for ceremony, not for command, but to steady the hearts of tired men. The beat echoes across the field like a heartbeat returning to a dying body. Boom, boom, boom. One officer calls it the sound of resolve. Now, let's rewind time just a little. While all this unfolds, Union General George Gordon Meade, newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac, is still miles away. He's only been in charge for 3 days. Let that sink in. 3 days. He inherited a fractured army, frayed morale, and a reputation he didn't ask for. And now, he receives word that his army is already fighting in a town he didn't choose, in a position he didn't approve. Most generals would panic. Meade doesn't. He sends immediate orders. Hold the high ground. Reinforcements are coming. He entrusts battlefield command to General Winfield Scott Hancock, a man whose presence alone is like pouring cold water on fire. Hancock arrives at Cemetery Hill around dusk. He surveys the chaos. Bodies everywhere. Officers arguing. Some regiments down to a quarter of their men. He doesn't flinch. Instead, he rides along the lines, slowly, calmly. He speaks directly to soldiers, not with grand speeches, not with melodrama, but with words they can believe in. This ground must be held, and I believe you will hold it. No threats, no glory, just belief, and it works. Men dig faster, officers reorganize, cannons find their targets. Cemetery Hill is no longer a fallback point. It's a stronghold. By 9 p.m., reinforcements begin arriving from the south. The Union is back in the fight. And yet, one question lingers. Why did Lee allow the day to end this way? Why didn't he press the advantage? The answer, like most truths in war, is complex. Lee didn't have full visibility of the field. Reports were late or conflicting. His men had marched and fought for hours without food or rest. The terrain was unknown, and perhaps, in the absence of Stonewall Jackson, he didn't fully trust his corps commanders. It's easy to judge in hindsight, but in real time, decisions are made in fog, literal and metaphorical. Still, many Confederate officers believed this was the moment, and they missed it. Meanwhile, in the town of Gettysburg itself, civilians tend to the wounded, both blue and gray. A Lutheran seminary becomes a field hospital. Kitchens are converted to triage centers. A young girl gives her only clean dress to wrap a soldier's shattered leg. And outside, the moaning never stops. Day one has ended, but the screaming hasn't. Doctors saw off limbs by lantern light. Soldiers write final letters with trembling hands. And in a small house near the square, a wounded Confederate whispers, "I thought we were winning." He's not wrong. Tactically, the Confederates did win the first day. They captured the town, drove Union forces from the ridges west and north, inflicted heavy casualties, but strategically, they left the Union Army sitting on the best defensive ground in Pennsylvania and gave them a full night to dig in. That's not victory. That's a traded advantage, a gamble, and the next morning, that gamble would come due. But for now, silence. For now, the wounded sleep. For now, generals draft orders by candlelight. And in a cemetery, A small Union flag is planted in the dirt. It flutters once and waits, because day one is done. But day two is coming, and it's going to be hell. Day 1, Part 3, the battlefield no one saw coming. Evening has fallen, but on the ridge lines south of Gettysburg, no one sleeps, not the generals, not the infantry, not the wounded men whispering prayers through clenched teeth, and not the townspeople, whose homes have become hospitals, whose gardens now hold bodies. The streets reek of gunpowder, sweat, blood, and fear. Gettysburg, a quiet town just yesterday, has been transformed into the nexus of history, drawn not by grand strategy, but by blind momentum. And by now, everyone knows, this isn't a skirmish anymore. It's the war center of gravity. But to understand what happens next, we need to step back, not in time, but in perspective, because Gettysburg wasn't chosen, it happened. Let's be clear, neither Lee nor Meade picked this town to fight in. It was the terrain that chose them. The geography, the roads, the ridges, the accident of encounter. But now that they're here, no one can leave. Here's why. Gettysburg is a hub. 10 major roads converge here like the spokes of a wheel. Control the town, you control movement. Control movement, you control momentum. Control momentum, you might just win the war. And yet, on the evening of July 1st, both armies are partially committed. The Confederates, exhausted from the day's fight, control the town itself. The Union, bloodied but regrouped, controls the high ground to the south. In military terms, the lines are fluid. In human terms, they're chaos. Let's zoom in, not on maps, but on men. In the darkness, a young Union private from the 149th Pennsylvania Volunteers writes in his journal by matchlight. We thought we'd be back in Maryland by now. Instead, I hear crying from the hill, and the ground feels like it's breathing under me. He's not imagining it, because beneath him, beneath every soldier digging a trench or loading a musket, are the freshly dug graves of Gettysburg Cemetery. Yes, the Union is literally defending a hill of the dead. Cemetery Hill, a place of silence before the war. Now, a place of defiance. There's poetry in that. And there's horror. On the Confederate side, there's confusion. Lee's army, victorious in the day's fight, is strangely uncertain. The town is theirs, but the initiative, gone. And the reason is simple. Information. Lee still doesn't have a full picture of the battlefield. His cavalry commander, J.E.B. Stuart, remains absent. No updates, no maps, no eyes. Imagine playing chess, blindfolded. That's Lee right now. To make matters worse, his corps commanders are new to their roles. After Stonewall Jackson's death 2 months earlier, Lee restructured his army. Now, instead of 3 nimble divisions under Jackson, he has 2 larger corps, led by generals less aggressive, less tested, less Stonewall. One of them, General Richard S. Ewell, hesitated to take Cemetery Hill earlier today. The chance is gone, and it won't come back. But this isn't just about generals. It's about momentum. And at Gettysburg, momentum doesn't feel like victory. It feels like gravity pulling both sides into something bigger than either one imagined. Back on the Union side, the commander of the 11th Corps, General Oliver Otis Howard, surveys the scene. His corps had broken earlier that day, retreating through town in disorder. Now, he's trying to rebuild shattered morale. Soldiers mutter that the 11th Corps always breaks. Some even call them the Flying Dutchman, a cruel nickname. Since many are German immigrants, Howard doesn't flinch. He walks the lines. He speaks to them directly, in English, in German. He doesn't sugarcoat, doesn't excuse the retreat. He just says, we stand, or we die. It works, sort of. Morale isn't high, but there's something better. Resolve. Sometimes, resolve is what you cling to when morale runs out. Nearby, on Cemetery Ridge, General Hancock, Meade's right-hand man, continues solidifying the position. He moves brigades like puzzle pieces, creating a rough fishhook formation from Cemetery Hill down to a rise called Little Round Top. We'll come back to that hill. Trust me, that hill will change the war. But for now, it's just quiet ground, the kind that soaks up blood really will. Meanwhile, Meade himself finally arrives on the battlefield, around midnight. He's cold, precise, calculating. Some say he lacks charisma, but what he lacks in fire, he makes up for in clarity. He speaks with no drama. He reviews reports, listens to his generals, studies maps, and then, just as quietly, he makes the decision that will define the battle. We stay, we fight here. Let that sink in. Meade didn't choose Gettysburg, but now that he's here, he chooses to own it, not as a trap, but as an opportunity. His reasoning is brutally simple. The high ground is strong. His army is already dug in. Lee is spread out and underinformed. And most importantly, if we retreat now, we never stop retreating. So Meade does what few Union generals had done before. He commits, fully, to this ground, to this moment, to this war. Now, here comes the twist. Lee, brilliant, bold, beloved, spends the evening preparing to attack. Yes, despite the uncertainty, despite the loss of initiative, despite his men's exhaustion, he's not pulling back. He's leaning in. To understand why, we need to understand Lee. He's not reckless, but he believes in offense. He believes in momentum. He believes that hesitation kills more soldiers than bullets. And after years of fighting against larger Union armies, he sees something familiar in Meade's caution. He believes the North is afraid. He believes if he punches hard enough tomorrow, he can break them, maybe not on the first blow, but eventually. So he tells his corps commanders, prepare to strike. They nod, they salute, but inside, there's doubt. Day one ends with an eerie silence. The moon is high, the fields are quiet, but the ground is shaking, not with cannon, but with possibility. No one knows what day two will bring, but everyone feels it coming, because Gettysburg isn't a battle anymore. It's a reckoning, and it has just begun. Day 1, Part 4. The silence between storms. It's past midnight. The stars above Gettysburg flicker like dying torches. Beneath them, tens of thousands of men lie in scattered silence, some asleep, some wounded, some already gone. It's hard to tell who belongs to which side anymore. Uniforms are covered in dirt, in blood, in soot. Color means nothing in the dark. But what does mean something? In fact, everything is position. And as day 1 of Gettysburg bleeds into day 2, position is all that matters. Let's talk about a concept military textbooks call the unearned advantage. It's when a side gains something critical, not through planning or brilliance, but by accident, timing, or sheer stubbornness. For the Union, that unearned advantage was this: the high ground, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and further south, 2 ridges no one's really paid attention to yet. Big Round Top, Little Round Top, they're about to matter, but right now, on the night of July 1st, they're just names on a map, if that. In Meade's headquarters, lanterns flicker. The air is stale with pipe smoke and exhaustion. Reports come in by messenger, handwritten, muddy, rushed. Commanders are still arriving. Divisions are still catching up. Meade gathers his generals. They stand in a loose circle. Faces gaunt, jackets unbuttoned. Each man speaks in turn. None say what they're thinking out loud. Can we really hold this ground? But Meade doesn't ask for guarantees. He asks for preparation. His plan is clear. Extend the line south. Anchor the flanks. Defend the ridge. Make Lee come to them. He knows what Lee will do. He knows exactly the kind of general he's facing. Because Lee is old school. The kind who believes that with enough courage, enough coordination, any enemy can break. And Meade's going to test that theory tomorrow. Across town, in the Confederate camp, Lee is awake. He walks the edge of his tent with hands clasped behind his back. He isn't writing orders. He isn't barking commands. He's thinking. Remember, Lee didn't choose Gettysburg, but now he's here, and he refuses to let go of the initiative. He plans to attack, but how? He gathers his corps commanders, Ewell and A.P. Hill. James Longstreet, his most trusted subordinate, is absent from this conference. And that's no accident, because Longstreet disagrees. He doesn't want to attack. He wants to maneuver south, find better ground, force Meade to attack them instead. It's bold, strategic, clean, but Lee says no. He believes the Union is vulnerable. He believes they won't stand a second blow. He believes that momentum favors the bold. And in fairness, he's been right before. So he tells his generals, "We'll strike their left tomorrow, at dawn, no hesitation." But as the men disperse, Lee is left alone, and for the first time, just for a moment, he wonders, am I fighting the battle I want, or the one the terrain has forced upon me? He doesn't say it aloud, but it lingers. Let's cut to the field. Nighttime at Gettysburg isn't quiet. It's alive. Cries echo from field hospitals. Horses wander, confused. Drummers tap signals in the dark, guiding units into place. Some soldiers dig in silence. Others mutter songs. One man carves a letter to his wife into the wooden stock of his rifle, just in case he never gets the chance to write again. Another pins a locket inside his jacket, a picture of his daughter. She's 3. She doesn't know where her father is tonight. The youngest soldier in the Union Army that day was 15. The oldest Confederate was 67. There's no standard age for fear, no uniform for courage, just men, waiting. And in the town itself, Gettysburg is no longer a town. It's a morgue. Civilians tend to the dying. Church pews are covered in bandages. Homes smell of whiskey and iron. A 9-year-old boy carries water from house to house, not knowing that he's stepping over limbs covered by canvas. In one barn, a doctor uses a rusty saw to amputate a Union soldier's leg. No anesthesia, just a leather belt between teeth. And in another basement, a Confederate prisoner weeps as a Union nurse presses a blood-soaked rag against his abdomen. No hatred, no words, just humanity, drowning in war. But here's the twist. Despite the horror, or perhaps because of it, something is shifting. The Union Army, for the first time in months, is choosing to stand, not fall back, not give ground, not fold under pressure. Stand, from the Potomac to the Hudson, from the Mississippi to Maine. Newspapers tomorrow will ask the same question. Can Meade hold? The answer is being written, now, by lantern light, by trench diggers, by artillerymen adjusting elevation by feel and prayer, and by Meade himself, who sends one last message to Washington. The enemy is in force. We hold the high ground. I shall fight here tomorrow. No bravado, no false hope, just a statement, just a line in the sand. And on the other side of that line, Robert E. Lee, perhaps the greatest general of his generation, preparing to strike. So where are we now? Let's recap, not with tactics, but with truth. A town no one wanted became the battlefield no one could escape. A Union army, once known for retreat, now refuses to move. A Confederate army, once invincible, now faces something it hasn't in years: resistance with backbone. And two generals, polar opposites, both believe that tomorrow will decide the war. They can't both be right. But here's what's certain. As day one ends, Gettysburg is no longer just a place. It's a promise that day two will be worse, more brutal, more strategic, more desperate, because the ground is now set. The ridge is now armed. The blood has already been spilled. And when the sun rises over Cemetery Ridge tomorrow morning, everything changes. Day 2, Part 1. The Anvil and the Hammer. Dawn breaks over Gettysburg, but it's not peaceful. It's anxious. The kind of dawn where nothing breathes right, not the trees, not the wind, not the men waiting for the storm they know is coming. The horizon glows red, not from the sun, from the embers of a battlefield still smoldering from the day before. And under that fire-streaked sky, Two armies stare at each other across a line of hills and valleys. One is battered, but dug in. The other is hungry, but overextended. One believes it's fighting for unity, the other for survival. And both know this day will decide everything. Because on July 2nd, 1863, Gettysburg becomes not just a battle, but a crucible. Let's begin where Lee begins. With a plan, the night before, Robert E. Lee resolved to attack. Not at the center. It's too well defended. Not at Cemetery Hill. Not yet. But on the flanks, especially the Union left. Why? Because it's exposed. The Union line stretches like a fishhook from Culp's Hill in the north to a low rise called Little Round Top in the south. And that southern tip, poorly guarded, almost forgotten. If Lee can seize it, he can enfilade the entire Union line, fire along it instead of at it. That's not just tactical advantage. That's checkmate. Now, here comes the first twist. Lee gives the job to James Longstreet, his most dependable corps commander. But Longstreet, he doesn't want to do it. He thinks Lee is making a mistake. He's convinced the Union has the better ground. He wants to swing around and force the Union to attack instead. They argue, quietly, respectfully, but firmly. Lee won't budge. Longstreet, reluctantly, obeys. But by the time his divisions are in position, hours have passed. They were supposed to strike at dawn. Instead, they'll attack after 4 p.m. That delay, it may have saved the Union. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back on the Union side, General Meade is already suspicious. He's no gambler, but he's a keen observer. He walks the ridgeline himself in the early hours, inspecting the terrain, asking questions his aides can't always answer. He knows Lee will strike. The only question is where. Then a captain points to a low rise of boulders and forest near the far left of the line. Little Round Top, no one's guarding it. Meade freezes, then sends a messenger. Get someone on that hill, now. And just like that, the race for Little Round Top begins. Enter Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a professor of rhetoric from Maine. No formal military training, but smart, principled, and utterly committed to the cause. He commands the 20th Maine, stationed at the extreme left of the Union line. They march hard, they climb fast. By late afternoon, they arrive on the hill. Out of breath, out of water, out of time, Chamberlain surveys the position. It's rough, rocky, exposed, but it's also the end of the line. If the Confederates get around it, the whole Union army could be rolled up like a carpet. He turns to his men and says the simplest order of his life, and the most important. You will hold this ground, no matter what. They nod, they dig in, they wait. They don't know what's coming, but we do. Down below, Confederate General John Bell Hood's division is preparing to attack. Texans, Alabamians, veterans of countless fights. They're marching uphill into hell, but they don't know it yet. They think it's just another ridge, another Union flank to break. They're wrong, because standing above them, rifles loaded, hearts pounding, is the 20th Maine, fewer than 400 strong, spread thin across uneven rock, with orders to never retreat. And here comes the second twist. They won't retreat. They can't, because there's nowhere to go. Behind him is a cliff. To their right, other regiments, also stretched thin, and in front of them, Confederates moving through the woods, fast and loud. Then comes the first wave, and everything explodes. Let's slow it down, because battle isn't all noise. It's rhythm. Crack, volley, reload. Crack, volley, reload. The 20th Maine fires downhill, holding the high ground, sending shock through the Confederate line. But they're outnumbered, and the Southern troops aren't stopping. They surge again, and again. Chamberlain sends men to cover the flanks. He bulls reserve companies from thin air. He moves along the line shouting encouragement, bleeding from a scraped leg but refusing to notice. He's not a professor anymore. He's a commander, and this, right here, right now, is his final exam. Time passes strangely in combat. Minutes feel like hours, an hour passes, then two, then the unthinkable. They run out of ammunition. Chamberlain's men are firing rocks, throwing muskets, fixing bayonets and praying the enemy doesn't notice they're firing blanks. But the enemy keeps coming. It's now or never. And here, in a moment that defies logic, military protocol, and probability, Chamberlain gives the order. Fix bayonets. Charge. A downhill bayonet charge against a numerically superior enemy. With no ammo, on broken ground. It's madness, but it works. The Confederates, stunned, hesitate. And that's all Chamberlain's men need. They crash into the enemy line like a wave of sharpened steel. And the enemy, they break, retreat, flee. The flank holds. The hill is saved. And with it, the entire Union position. Later, Chamberlain will say, in great deeds, something abides. He's right, because what happened on Little Round Top that day wasn't just bravery. It was brilliance under pressure. It was instinct over fear. It was one man, a teacher, rising to meet the moment history had carved for him. He was supposed to teach Shakespeare. Instead, he taught how to hold a republic together with a bayonet. And that was only the beginning of day two, because while the 20th Maine was holding the far left, chaos was erupting everywhere else on the field. The wheat field, the peach orchard, Devil's Den, blood would soak every inch. But that is for part two, because Chamberlain wasn't the only one fighting to hold the line. And Gettysburg was far from done. Day 2, Part 2, where hell bloomed among peach trees. Let's rewind the clock by a few hours. While Chamberlain and the 20th Maine were locking bayonets on Little Round Top, something far messier was unfolding to their north and east. Something loud, chaotic, and horrifyingly symmetrical. It wasn't a single battle. It was 5 fights at once, all tangled, all screaming, all desperate, and all of it sparked because of one fatal flaw. The Union's left center was dangling in the air. Here's how that happened. General Daniel Sickles, a New York politician turned general, commanded the Union Third Corps. And Sickles, he didn't like where Meade had told him to set up. He was supposed to anchor between Little Round Top and Cemetery Ridge, a strong, defensive, high ground position. But Sickles looked at the terrain and decided to disobey. He marched his entire corps forward, almost a mile, to a rise of ground near a peach orchard. Why? Because it looked better. It felt right. He didn't consult Meade, didn't wait for orders. He just moved. A freelance maneuver in a war with tens of thousands of lives at stake. And in doing so, Sickles created a bulge in the Union line. A salient, a protrusion without proper flanks. Hard to defend, easy to crush. Lee saw it instantly and pounced. Let's zoom into the map. The peach orchard, a quiet, blooming stretch of farmland, surrounded by wooden fences, narrow lanes, and open fields. To its left, the wheat field, waist-high stalks of golden grain. To its right, Devil's Den, a mass of twisted boulders and caves. Nature's own fortress. These 3 spots would become the bloodiest terrain of day 2. And it all starts with cannon. Confederate artillery opens up in the early afternoon. The peach orchard is shredded. Wood splinters fly like razors. Fruit trees snap in half. Shells scream across the open air like demons looking for a home. Then comes the infantry. From the west, General McLaws' division. From the south, General Hood's Texans. Already bloodied from the Little Round Top assault, they hit Sickles' line like a hammer on glass. The Union position begins to buckle immediately. One brigade, the 141st Pennsylvania, loses 198 of its 209 men in under 30 minutes. A color bearer from New York is shot 3 times in the chest, but refuses to drop the flag. A drummer boy crawls through the wheat, both legs shattered, still beating his drum. They're not holding, they're drowning. Sickles himself, the man who caused the chaos, tries to rally his men. And then, suddenly, a cannonball rips through the air. and takes his leg clean off. He falls, bleeding, screaming, still giving orders. He's evacuated in a stretcher, cigar still clenched between his teeth. And as he's carried away, he raises a hand and salutes. A showman to the last. Now let's move to the wheat field. It's not a battlefield, it's a blender. Brigades charge in, get chewed up, fall back, another goes in. Repeat, in 6 separate waves. Union and Confederate troops trade the same piece of ground back and forth, for hours. The field turns from gold to red. Corpses lie in rows between furrows, some still grasping ears of wheat in their fingers. One general calls it a slaughterhouse without walls. By evening, more than 4.00 men have fallen in the wheat field, and no one controls it. Not the Union, not the Confederates, just death. He owns it now, a few hundred yards away. Devil's Den, the name says it all. Massive boulders, jagged ravines, shadowy crevices. It's a natural fortress, and the Confederates want it. Because from there, they can fire up into Little Round Top and collapse the Union line. So Hood's men charge in. Union sharpshooters hold the rocks. They fire down with deadly precision. One Confederate officer is hit in the eye while aiming. Another is blown backwards by a round that punches through his chest and keeps going. But the Confederates don't stop. They climb, scramble, scream, and eventually they break through. Devil's Den falls. Confederate flags are planted among the rocks. But it's not victory, because the moment they arrive, Union artillery from Little Round Top begins raining death down onto the boulders. It's hell in granite. One soldier describes the sound as rocks crying. And there's no cover. Bodies begin piling in the crevices. And Devil's Den becomes a tomb for both sides. So let's pause. What's happening here? What's the bigger picture? Simple. Lee's grand plan to roll up the Union flank is working. Sort of. Chamberlain's charge saved Little Round Top, but the center is falling apart. Meade scrambles reserves to plug holes. Artillery is repositioned on the fly. Entire brigades disappear into the wheat and don't come back. The Union line is no longer a line. It's a string of isolated islands, each fighting alone. And the Confederates, they're running out of steam, but they don't know it. So they push harder, harder, and then something happens. Not on the battlefield, but in the sky. Dark clouds, a sudden rumble, and then rain, heavy, sudden, biblical. It drenches the wounded, extinguishes fires, soaks powder. It turns the wheat field into mud, makes the cannons choke, the muskets misfire, and it does something else. 2. It stops the advance, a natural ceasefire, as if the heavens themselves whispered, "Enough." When the rain passes, the battlefield is silent. No cheers, no cries, just the wind blowing across orchards that no longer bloom, wheat fields that no longer wave. And on the high ground, Little Round Top still stands, but just barely, and below it, thousands lie still, in orchards, in wheat, in stone. Day 2 is done, not with a bang, but with exhaustion. So where does that leave us? Lee gained ground. Meade held his line. Both sides bled more than they can afford. But here's the twist. Lee still believes he can win. He believes the Union center is weak. He believes Meade is running out of men. He believes that one more push, just one, will crack them wide open. He's wrong, but tomorrow, he'll try anyway. And what comes next will be even worse. Because on day 3 of Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee makes the most controversial decision of his career, and 12.50 men will pay the price. Day 2, Part 3, The Hill That Whispered in the Dark. While the peach orchard burned, while wheat turned red, while bayonets flashed on Little Round Top, another storm was brewing in the shadows. Quiet, overlooked, but no less deadly, because while the Union left was battered by fire, the right was about to be swallowed by darkness. Let me take you there, to a steep, wooded ridge just east of Gettysburg. It doesn't look like much, but this hill This lump of earth, tangled in trees and fog, is about to become the stage for the first sustained night assault of the Civil War. And it will nearly undo everything Meade fought to preserve. The name, Culp's Hill. Let's set the stage. Culp's Hill anchors the Union's far right. It forms the top of the fishhook in Meade's defensive line. It's steep, forested, hard to climb. But that's exactly why it matters. Because if the Confederates can seize it, they can sweep into the rear of Cemetery Hill and roll out the entire Union army from the right. It would be catastrophic, and for a few moments on the evening of July 2nd, 1863, that catastrophe comes dangerously close to becoming real. Earlier that day, the hill was heavily defended. Union breastworks, artillery, veteran regiments from New York and Pennsylvania. But Meade, reacting to Sickles' disaster on the left, had to make a choice: reinforce the crumbling left or hold steady on the right. He chose to shift troops left toward Little Round Top and the Peach Orchard. And Sir Culp's Hill, though still defended, became vulnerable, just vulnerable enough. And the Confederates, they noticed, enter General Edward Allegheny Johnson. He commands a division of Confederate troops from Virginia and North Carolina. Lee orders him to probe the Union right. It's late, after 6 p.m. Smoke hangs low, visibility drops, birdsong goes silent. Johnson's men march toward Culp's Hill, not with trumpets, but with breath held. They move in ghost-like silence, their gray coats vanishing into the trees. And the hill waits. Up top, Union troops under General George S. Greene, a 62-year-old engineer and one of the most criminally underrated commanders of the war, brace for impact. His men are outnumbered 5-1. Most reinforcements have been pulled away. There's no artillery left, but Greene has something else: engineering. Weeks before, he had ordered deep entrenchments across the hill, dugouts, rock walls, log parapets, and now, under moonlight, those fortifications are the only things standing between his line and oblivion. Then comes the assault. It's like a thunderstorm crashing through the forest. Rebel yells, musket flashes, the snap of branches and the thud of boots on wet leaves. The Confederates hit the Union right like a tidal wave, but Greene's defenses hold. At first, what follows is pure chaos. You see, battles are hard enough in daylight, but at night, it's madness. Men fire at shadows. Officers lose their own regiments. One soldier accidentally bayonets a tree stump, then apologizes to it. Another fires 3 times at a silhouette, only to discover it's a mule. Smoke doesn't rise, it hangs, low and choking, flash by flash, moment by moment. The lines collapse into fragmented, personal war. Small groups fight in pockets. No one knows where the line is, and for the first time in the battle, the Union's right flank begins to bend. Then, the twist. Johnson's men, advancing through the trees, do something Meade never expected. They occupy part of the Union earthworks. Yes, they make it inside. And for an hour, they control the lower slopes of Culp's Hill. They've breached the Union line. From here, they could strike into the rear, into Cemetery Hill. And if coordinated with another push, it's over. But nothing is coordinated, because in the dark, no one knows, not even Lee. Let me pause here. This precise moment is one of the most dangerous for the Union Army in the entire Civil War. Not Pickett's Charge, not Antietam. Right now, a Confederate division is perched on their flank, inside their line, and Meade doesn't know it yet, because his focus is still on the left, where Sickles' collapse and Chamberlain's stand have taken all attention. Meanwhile, Greene's men, what's left of them, hold on by instinct. They fight with whatever they can grab. One group throws rocks, another resorts to bayonet lunges without firing. No retreat, no orders, just defense. Then, salvation. Sometime after 9 p.m., reinforcements arrive. A Union brigade under General Thomas Ruger, finally freed from the center, marches toward Culp's Hill. They hear the sounds before they arrive. The screams, the sharp cracks, The eerie silence between volleys. They move fast, they don't wait for daylight. And what follows is one of the few true night battles of the Civil War. Union troops counterattack in the dark, without clear lines, without maps, without mercy, and somehow, through sheer woolen terrain, they begin pushing Johnson's men back. It isn't pretty, it isn't glorious, but by midnight, the Confederate foothold is shrinking, and by 1 a.m., they're in retreat. They leave behind wounded, rifles, one soldier's diary, soaked in blood, still open to the words, "We had it, and we let it go." Let's pause again. What just happened? Lee's flank attack on the left had failed. His unexpected assault on the right came within inches of victory. But darkness, confusion, and Greene's stubborn engineering saved the day. No one cheers, no one sleeps. Culp's Hill isn't secure, but it's still Union, and that matters, because if it had fallen, you wouldn't be listening to this in a united country. You'd be hearing the story of a nation lost by a hill no one saw coming. So what's next? It's 2 a.m. Lee meets with his generals. He's frustrated. He thinks they missed opportunities, and he's not wrong. But instead of retreat, instead of adjusting, he decides to try again. Tomorrow, but this time, not on the flanks, on the center, a direct assault across open fields against a dug-in enemy. Some call it bold, others call it madness. We'll call it what it is. Pickett's Charge, and you'll hear all of it in part 4, because the hill has been held, but the price is only going to get steeper. Day 2, part 4, the longest night. Midnight, the battlefield sleeps, but no one does. Not in the Union camps, not in the Confederate camps, not in Gettysburg, where walls still echo with the groans of the wounded, and backyards double as mass graves. Day 2 has ended, but the war has not. What lingers now isn't the sound of gunfire. It's something deeper, doubt, whispers, decisions yet unmade. This is the long night, the moment between violence and vengeance, when generals stare into maps and wonder whether tomorrow will bring glory or annihilation. And as we'll see, some already know the answer. Let's start with Lee. He sits in his headquarters tent, poring over hand-drawn maps lit only by lantern flame. The tent flaps open. General James Longstreet enters. His coat is dusty, his eyes heavy, his voice low. He speaks carefully. "General, I still believe we should move around their left. Make them come to us." It's not the first time he's said it. And once again, Lee listens. But his answer doesn't change. The enemy is there, and I am going to attack him there. Longstreet's jaw tightens. He knows what Lee is proposing. A frontal assault across open fields, straight into the center of the Union line, where their defenses are strongest. It goes against every lesson in warfare. And Longstreet, veteran, cautious, brilliant, knows it won't work. He doesn't argue, not directly, but later that night, when an aide asks him how he feels about the plan, he mutters 5 chilling words. "That old man, he's going to get my division killed." He's not wrong, but we're not there yet. Now let's go north, into Union headquarters. Meade is exhausted. He's barely slept in 2 days. His uniform is still blood-spattered from his rounds at the front. But his mind, sharp. He gathers his corps commanders in a candlelit farmhouse. No speeches, no fanfare. He simply asks, "Gentlemen, what do you expect Lee will do tomorrow?" A silence. Then General John Gibbon, whose division holds the Union Center, speaks first. "He attacked our left, he attacked our right. It stands to reason he will attack the center." Meade nods, then replies, "If he does, I shall give him all the rope he wants." Simple, cold, and deadly. Meade isn't looking for a fight. But if Lee gives him one, he'll answer, and he'll answer with everything. Let's go back to the Confederate lines. The night is cold now. Troops sleep in blood-soaked coats. Some write final letters by campfire. Others sharpen bayonets by moonlight. And in a small clearing, one man stares silently into the distance. His name, George Pickett, Brigadier General, Virginian, charismatic, romantic. He hasn't fought at Gettysburg yet. His division is fresh, and tomorrow, he'll lead the charge, though he doesn't know it yet. Pickett spends the night in quiet prayer. He thinks of his fiancée, Sally. The last letter he wrote her said, "If I fall, know that I fell for Virginia." It sounds noble, but in 12 hours, that line will become prophecy. Back in Meade's camp, the night remains tense. He doesn't sleep. Instead, he writes the lines, checking on his men, listening to their fears. At one battery, he finds a young artillery officer crying over the body of a gunner. Meade doesn't speak. He simply places a hand on the boy's shoulder. Later, a private writes, "We didn't follow Meade because he was loud. We followed him because he showed up." Meanwhile, General Hancock, the Rock of Cemetery Ridge, gathers his staff. He knows tomorrow could be decisive. He walks the entire front, checking artillery positions, spacing, supply. He orders fresh dirt packed behind cannon embrasures. He has 80 guns lining his sector, and they're ready. Across the field, 1.400 yards away, lies open farmland. Rolling hills, scattered fences, no cover, no trees, no mercy. And that's where Lee wants to send his men. Let's pause here. This is the hook. 2 generals, 2 doctrines, 1 field. Lee believes the Union center will break under the weight of shock and awe. Meade believes the Confederate center will break under the weight of Union guns and resolve. And between them, a mile of open ground, and a moment in history that neither man will ever forget. Now here's the plot twist. Lee isn't reckless. He's not suicidal. He's just out of time. He knows reinforcements from Grant are pressuring the South in Mississippi. He knows Northern morale might bounce if Meade wins here. He knows that if he doesn't win now, he'll be forced back across the Potomac and maybe never return. This charge isn't about battlefield logic. It's about political urgency. And for Lee, this is the gamble. All in, all at once. And Pickett will be the spear point. Meanwhile, in Union lines, soldiers prepare as best they can. Some pray, some dig, some write their names on slips of paper and pin them inside their coats, in case their bodies can't be identified. A few joke nervously, "If we die, at least we won't have to clean the latrines." One soldier hands his Bible to a chaplain and says, "I won't need this tomorrow." "You will." They laugh, but only a little. At 3 a.m., fog rolls over the field. It settles between the ridges like a ghost army, hiding the truth, hiding fate. It feels like the breath before the scream. And as dawn approaches, both sides brace. No bugles, no speeches, just silence. And then, the slow click of artillery being primed, the thump of boots, the rustle of flags. Pickett meets with his brigade commanders. He lays out the plan. They nod, salute, and walk away. Some of them, for the last time. And up on Cemetery Ridge, Union gunners finish their prep. Cannons are double loaded, range markers are set, fuses are cut to 1 second. They're ready, as one gunner whispers, "Let them come. We've got enough iron to blot out the sun." And that's where we end this night. On the edge of madness. With maps drawn, lines set, letters written, graves half dug. Because tomorrow, 12.50 men will walk across open fields. And only a few will walk back. Day 2, Part 5. The breath before the cannons. July 3rd hasn't begun yet, but you can feel it, pressing down on Gettysburg like a storm just out of sight. The moon is fading, the air is still, even the wind seems to hesitate, and both armies are waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for sunlight, waiting for fate, and for one of the last times in American history. Everything is balanced, but not for long, because between midnight and morning, something happens, something most historians skip. But soldiers never forget: the quiet, that eerie, unnatural stillness before the world changes forever. Let's step into it. On Cemetery Ridge, Union soldiers stand by the guns. They've been awake all night. Some haven't slept in days. Their boots are soaked, their eyes red, their fingers wrapped in cloth to prevent powder burns. And yet, they joke. They joke because that's what men do when they don't know if they'll see the sun again. One artilleryman carves, for Lincoln, into the barrel of his cannon. Another sings softly to himself, not realizing he's doing it. Home. Home on the range. But there's no range, no buffalo, only the knowledge that somewhere in the fog ahead, 12.00 Confederates are forming ranks. And they're coming. Back at the Union Center, General Hancock walks the line. He doesn't give speeches, he gives presents. He checks on the wounded. He helps move ammunition crates. He reminds every gunner, every infantryman, every drummer boy, they'll come across that field. And when they do, we hold. He doesn't say if, he says when, because Hancock knows what Lee is planning. Everyone does, but it doesn't make it easier to believe, because what Lee is planning defies belief across the lines. In the Confederate camp, General George Pickett is writing. It's just before dawn. His tent is quiet. The candlelight flickers. And in a letter to his beloved Sally, he writes, "Tomorrow, we advance. Should I not return? No, I walked with honor." He seals the note, hands it to an aide, and walks outside into the chill. Pickett has never commanded a charge this large, but he believes in it. He believes in Lee. He believes in Virginia, and belief will carry men further than orders, even when belief is wrong. At 4:30 a.m., a lone bird sings, then silence again, then thunder, not from the sky, from the earth, from 150 Confederate guns unleashing hell. It's the largest artillery barrage of the Civil War, and it's just begun. Shells scream overhead. Union guns return fire. The air fills with smoke so thick it turns morning to dusk. The ground shakes. Fences splinter. Men cover their ears as iron crashes all around them. This is not war. This is punishment. Then for 2 full hours, the heavens fall. Let's slow down, because in the middle of this barrage, while cannons roar and trees snap, while the smell of sulfur drowns the scent of wheat, time bends. Some men go deaf, others lie flat, eyes open, watching splinters fly by their heads like daggers. At one battery, a Union gunner writes, "I thought I was already dead, only the shaking of the earth told me otherwise." And then, just as suddenly as it began, silence. The cannons stop, all of them, as if someone had pulled the plug on the apocalypse. And what follows is even worse. Nothing, no sound, no movement, just the wind, finally returning, brushing past broken limbs and torn banners. Union gunners look to their officers. Is it over? But no one answers, because they all know this is the breath before the charge. And let's not forget Culp's Hill. Yes, while cannons thundered across the open fields, fighting still raged on the right. Through the early morning of July 3rd, Greene's troops had once again fended off renewed Confederate attacks in the woods. They were tired, undersupplied, but undefeated, and by dawn, the stars and stripes still flew above the rocks of Culp's Hill. That, too, mattered, because while Pickett's men would charge the center, a breach on the Union right would have made that charge irrelevant. But there was no breach, thanks to Greene, the old engineer, and his mud-covered men from New York. So now we return to the center. Cemetery Ridge. Meade watches from a low stone wall. He has said almost nothing all morning. He lets Hancock command the field. And Hancock is a statue. Calm, still, perfectly placed. Around him, artillery crews reload. Infantry grips their rifles. One soldier recites the Lord's Prayer under his breath, over and over again. Another closes his eyes and imagines Boston Harbor, not because he misses it, but because it's clean, because it's not here. And then it happens, just past 3 p.m. A glint of sunlight, a ripple in the haze, and 12.50 Confederate troops emerge from the trees. In formation, marching, straight, silent, deadly, like a wall of gray ghosts moving toward destiny. And at their front is Pickett, sword raised, Hat off, eyes forward. He doesn't look like a general. He looks like a man chasing his own fate. Union soldiers stare in disbelief. It's real. It's happening. The Confederates are crossing open ground. No cover, no smoke, just lines of men. It's like watching a dream become nightmare. One private whispers, "They're not stopping." And they don't, because this isn't a skirmish. This is Pickett's Charge, but that is day 3. So we end day 2 not with triumph, not with collapse, but with resolve. The Union line has held. Barely. The Confederate army has bled deeply, and both commanders, Lee and Meade, have drawn their lines. Tomorrow, there will be no flanking, no hills, no wheat fields, only a question: can you break the center? And in that answer lies the fate of a nation. Day 3, Part 1. The March into Madness. July 3rd, 1863, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The final day. The air is damp, the sky a dull gray, and across the fields of wheat and blood, a decision is about to be made. A decision that will echo not just through history books, but through graves, through families, through the very identity of a nation. General Robert E. Lee, the Marble Man, the master of maneuver, the undefeated titan of the South, is about to gamble everything. Not on cunning, not on terrain, not even on surprise, but on belief. Belief that courage can conquer cannon. Belief that devotion can defy physics. Belief that honor alone can shatter empires. But belief, like any weapon, can misfire. And today, it will. The decision isn't made in a burst of lightning. It unfolds quietly across the dim hours of morning. Lee walks the Confederate lines at dawn. His face is pale, calm, his words measured. To some, he seems confident. To others, distracted. But all agree, he has made up his mind. He will strike the Union center, head on, across 1 mile of open field, against dug-in troops and 80 cannon. Because, in his view, Meade has reinforced both flanks, Little Round Top and Culp's Hill. That means the center must be vulnerable. It's textbook logic, except this battlefield doesn't follow textbooks, and Meade hasn't weakened his center. In fact, he's doubled it, and yet, Lee doesn't know, because his cavalry under J.B. Stuart has been absent for days. And without eyes, even a genius can go blind. Now let's meet the men Lee chooses to carry his dream across that deadly field. 12.50 infantrymen, mostly Virginians, Carolinians, Alabamians, Mississippians, veterans, volunteers, believers. At their front, General George Pickett. He's new to Gettysburg. His division didn't fight on day 1 or day 2. They're fresh, and Lee wants fresh legs for what comes next. Pickett is charismatic, flamboyant. He wears a curled mustache and long, flowing hair, more poet than killer. But today, he becomes something else. A symbol of glory, of loyalty, of tragedy. Beside Pickett, Brigadier General James Johnston Pettigrew, commanding North Carolinians who'd already taken heavy losses. And on the left, General Isaac Trimble, stepping in last minute after another commander was wounded. Together, they will form the wave, the gray tide that Lee believes will crash against the blue and split it open. But not everyone agrees. Let's go back to Longstreet, Lee's trusted right hand. He doesn't speak much, but when he does, men listen. And when Lee gives the order to prepare Pickett's men for the charge, Longstreet's response is chilling. It is my opinion that number 15.00 men ever arranged for battle can take that position. Lee hears it, but doesn't flinch. He believes. And when belief becomes obsession, reason drowns. While plans are laid, the Union is watching. General Winfield Scott Hancock stands tall on Cemetery Ridge. No nerves, no pretense, just steel. He sees movement in the Confederate lines, formations, flags, drums, and he knows they're coming here. He says, let them come. Behind him, Union artillerymen check their fuses. They aren't afraid, they're ready. They know the ground, they own the elevation, and they've had 2 days to prepare. One gunner writes in his diary, "If they charge us, they won't reach the fence. If they do, they won't reach the wall. If they do, I'll eat my boots." He didn't, because he didn't have to. At 11 a.m., Confederate Artillery Commander E.P. Alexander begins preparing the largest bombardment ever launched on American soil up to that point. Over 140 guns are aligned across Seminary Ridge. Cannonballs, shells, shrapnel. They'll fire first, softening the Union center, breaking their lines. Also, they hope. It's a logical plan and a fatal misunderstanding, because the Union guns, they won't be destroyed. They're too well dug in. And when the smoke clears, they'll still be there, loaded, angry, and aimed at a mile of empty field. But before that, silence. One final pause. Confederate infantry line up behind trees. Drummers stand at the ready. Officers check swords, sidearms, faces. No one speaks. Some men pray. Some write names on slips of paper and pin them inside their jackets. Others tie handkerchiefs around their necks, not as decoration, but so their bodies can be identified when they fall. It's morbid, but it's practical, because they know, even if their generals don't. At 1:07 p.m., a single cannon fires, then another, then the world ends. A thunderclap of iron and smoke and flame. Shells scream over the field. Trees explode into splinters. The ground trembles like it's trying to shake the war off its skin. For 2 hours, the air is alive with death. It's not a bombardment. It's a conversation between gods. And in the middle, men, shaking, bleeding, waiting for the signal to charge. Some Confederate soldiers press their faces into the earth and whisper, "Don't make me go, but the order will come." Because plans don't stop for prayers. On Cemetery Ridge, Union gunners take cover, let the Confederate shells fly overhead. They fire back, but not at full strength. Why? Because General Henry Hunt, Union Chief of Artillery, gives a curious order. Slow down, let them think we're knocked out. It's psychological warfare, and it works. The Confederates begin to believe they're winning the cannon duel, that the Union guns are gone, that the charge can work. So at 3 p.m., the cannons fall silent, the smoke begins to clear, and through the haze comes a trumpet call, then a voice, then the unmistakable sound of boots, marching, thousands of boots, across open ground, toward the war, toward the guns, toward history. And this is where we end part 1, not with the charge, but with the breath before the charge. Because sometimes, the silence before the storm is louder than the storm itself. And what happens next will change America forever. Day 3, Part 2, into the field of fire. The woods are behind them. The field is ahead, and the men of Pickett's, Pettigrew's, and Trimble's divisions begin to march. Not run, not scramble, march, a mile of open ground, stretching out like a sentence with no punctuation. At first, it's quiet. No bullets, no shells, just boots over grass. Some whisper hymns, others shout names of hometowns. One man from Mississippi mutters, "Maybe they're gone, maybe the guns are gone." They're not, they're waiting. From Cemetery Ridge, the Union line watches. No one fires yet, not because they hesitate, because they aim. Every cannon has been sighted, every rifle loaded, every officer told, "Don't waste it, let them get close." And still, the Confederates come, rows of gray stretched across the horizon. It's a beautiful sight, and then, it becomes a massacre. At roughly 3:05 p.m., the first volley, Union artillery opens up with a roar that seems to split the sky. Canister shot, thousands of small lead balls packed into one shell. When it fires, it doesn't explode, it shreds. At 400 yards, it tears holes through the Confederate ranks. Men fall by dozens, entire rows vanish. It's like God is dragging his hand across the field, erasing names from history before they can even be spoken. But still, they come, still marching, still stepping over bodies, still believing. Because they were told, the center is weak. They were told, one push, that's all it'll take. They were told, glory, but all they get is fire. Let's slow it down. Let's focus on one brigade. Armistead's. Brigadier General Lewis Armistead, a Virginian, in his 50s, deeply religious. He rides behind his men, hat raised on his sword. He tells them, do your duty, boys, for your homes, for your wives, for your sweethearts, and if you must die, die like men. They cheer and keep marching. Around him, chaos. One shell bursts above his right flank. Another carves a hole straight through the 57th Virginia. Drummers vanish. Flag bearers fall. Men stagger sideways, as if drunk on death. But Armistead, still upright, still moving. And he's not alone. On the left, Pettigrew's men are taking even worse fire. These are North Carolinians. Some have already fought 2 days straight. They're exhausted, and now they face rifled musket fire from the 8th Ohio. From a flank that wasn't supposed to be there. Lee thought the Union left had been pulled away. It hadn't. They're there, and they're angry. Volley after volley crashes into Pettigrew's brigade like waves against cliffs. Except this time, the cliffs crumble. Pettigrew is wounded. Several of his officers are dead. His men begin to falter. And still, Union cannons fire. From Cemetery Ridge, from Cemetery Hill, even from Little Round Top, now far to the south. It's not a crossfire, it's a furnace, and the men inside are burning. Back in the center, the Union artillery slows. They have to. Their barrels are overheating. Crews are down to bare hands. Some cannons jam from the heat. So now comes the infantry. The 69th Pennsylvania, the 71st, the 106th, all waiting behind stone walls. All about to do what cannon could not. Stop the charge, man to man. And yet, despite everything, the Confederates keep coming. Fewer now, smaller formations, lines fraying, but still moving forward, like a ghost army refusing to dissolve. One Union officer writes, "I've never seen such bravery, nor such futility." Then, a twist. The Confederate center begins to converge. Lines fold inward, flags cluster, because the fences, yes, the wooden fences that run across the Emmitsburg Road, are forcing the men into bottlenecks. To keep moving, they must climb the fences, under fire, so they throw their rifles over, clamber up, leap down, and every time they do, another cannon fires, another volley cuts through. It's not a battle, it's a harvest. And yet, incredibly, some reach the road, and cross, and keep going, toward the low stone wall at the crest of Cemetery Ridge, the high water mark of the Confederacy. That's what historians will later call it. But the men don't know that. They don't care. All they see is the wall. Beyond it, Union rifles. Behind it, Union flags. And between them, a few final steps. So they scream, and they charge. Armistead's brigade, or what's left of it, is leading the final surge. He raises his hat on his sword and shouts, "Follow me, boys, give them the steel." And they do. A few dozen men, out of thousands. They reach the wall. They leap over. They fire. They stab. They fall. One Confederate plants his hands on the stone and is shot in the throat. Another raises the flag and is hit by 2 bullets. And Armistead, he makes it. He touches the cannon behind the wall, the furthest any Southerner will get. And then, he is shot. Twice, once in the arm, once in the leg. He falls into Union hands, alive, barely, and whispers, "Tell Hancock, I've done my duty." They were best friends, you see, Hancock and Armistead. From before the war, back when America wasn't split in two, back when lines weren't drawn in blood. Let's pause, look around. The field is full of smoke, of broken flags, of limbs, of silence. The charge is broken. It never reached its goal. The center didn't break, because it never wavered, and of the 12.500 men who began that march, More than 6,000 are now dead, wounded, or missing in under an hour. Think about that. More casualties in one failed charge than the entire American Revolution's Battle of Bunker Hill. That's what Lee's belief bought him. Not victory, not fame, just names on stones and letters that never made it home. And that's not even the end, because what Lee does next might surprise you, but that's for part 3. Because right now, this field of fire has gone cold, and on it, America has just made a choice. Day 3, Part 3, The Weight of Failure. The smoke begins to clear. The echoes of cannon fire fade into an eerie silence. Across the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg, the remnants of Pickett's charge stagger back toward Confederate lines. Faces pale, eyes hollow, uniforms tattered and stained with the marks of battle. Among them, General George Pickett rides slowly, his flamboyant demeanor replaced by a vacant stare. He approaches General Robert E. Lee, who sits astride his horse, surveying the devastation. Lee's expression is unreadable, a mask of composure over turmoil. Pickett halts, his voice barely above a whisper. "General Lee, I have no division." The words hang in the air, heavy with the weight of loss. Lee nods solemnly, acknowledging the grim reality. "Come, General Pickett, we must look to our defenses." But Pickett remains motionless, the magnitude of the disaster rendering him numb. Nearby, General James Longstreet observes the scene, his heart weighed down by a sense of foreboding fulfilled. He had opposed the charge, sensing its futility, but had followed orders nonetheless. Now, as he watches the shattered remnants of the assault return, he feels no vindication, only sorrow. An aide approaches Longstreet cautiously. "General, your orders." Longstreet's voice is low, almost a growl. "We prepare for the counterattack." But deep down, he knows there may be no counterattack. The Army of Northern Virginia has spent its strength, and the enemy stands unbroken. As the day wanes, Lee rides along the lines, offering words of encouragement to his weary men. He stops to speak with General Cadmus Wilcox, whose brigade has suffered grievous losses. Wilcox, near tears, begins to explain the state of his command. Lee interrupts gently, extending his hand. "Never mind, General, all this has been my fault. It is I who have lost this fight, and you must help me out of it in the best way you can." The admission is startling. The great Robert E. Lee, revered and almost mythic in the eyes of his men, taking full responsibility for the defeat. It's a moment that humanizes the legend, revealing the depth of his character. As night falls over Gettysburg, the Confederate camp is shrouded in a somber quiet. Fires burn low, casting flickering shadows over faces etched with exhaustion and grief. Lee sits alone in his tent, maps spread before him, but his eyes are distant, unfocused. The weight of command, of decisions made and the devastating consequences, presses heavily upon him. He reaches for a pen, intending to draft reports, but hesitates. What words could encapsulate the enormity of this day? Instead, he bows his head, whispering a prayer for the souls lost and for guidance in the trials yet to come. Meanwhile, in the Union camp, there is no jubilation, only a grim acknowledgement of the day's events. General George Meade walks among his men, offering quiet commendations. He knows the battle is a turning point, but at what cost? Thousands lie dead or wounded, and the war is far from over. In a nearby field hospital, the wounded from both sides are tended to. Among them, General Lewis Olmsted, mortally wounded during the charge, lies pale and sweating. He asks after his old friend, Union General Winfield Scott Hancock, not knowing that Hancock too has been wounded. Olmsted's thoughts drift to earlier days, before the war tore friendships and the nation asunder. He grips the hand of a nearby officer. "Tell General Hancock, I have done my duty." With that, he slips into unconsciousness, his breathing shallow. The room is thick with the scent of antiseptic and the moans of the injured. A Union chaplain kneels beside Olmsted, offering quiet prayers. The scene is a poignant reminder of the personal costs of this great conflict. Back on the Confederate side, Lee convenes a council of war with his remaining generals. The atmosphere is heavy, the air thick with unspoken recriminations and despair. Lee's voice is steady but somber. We must prepare to withdraw. The enemy will not remain idle, and we cannot withstand another engagement of this scale. Longstreet nods, his face a mask of stoic acceptance. He had foreseen this outcome but takes no solace in being right. The generals discuss the logistics of retreat, the challenges of moving wounded, and the ever-present threat of Union pursuit. It's a daunting task, but there is no alternative. The dream of victory in Pennsylvania has turned to ashes. As preparations for withdrawal commence, Lee takes a moment to himself. Stepping away from the bustle of the camp, he gazes out over the battlefield, now eerily quiet under the moon's pale light. The fields that had echoed with the thunder of artillery and the cries of the wounded now lie still, a silent testament to the day's carnage. Lee's mind drifts to the families who will receive word of their loved ones' fates, to the letters he must write, the condolences he must offer. The burden is immense, but he shoulders it as he always has, with dignity and resolve. Yet, in this quiet moment, away from prying eyes, a single tear traces down his withered cheek. In the days that follow, the Confederate army begins its retreat southward. The roads are clogged with wagons carrying the wounded, the dying, and the weight of defeat. Rain falls steadily, turning the paths to mud, mirroring the somber mood of the troops. Lee rides among them, offering what encouragement he can. But the spark that once ignited the cause has dimmed. The retreat is arduous, fraught with challenges and skirmishes. But eventually, they cross back into Virginia. The invasion of the North has ended, and with it, perhaps, the Confederacy's best hope for victory. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln receives news of the Union victory at Gettysburg. But there is no celebration in his heart. He knows the war is far from over, and the cost of this battle has been staggering. He walks to a window, looking out over the city, his face etched with lines of worry and fatigue. The weight of the nation rests heavily upon his shoulders. He knows that beyond the strategies and battles, the true challenge lies ahead, to heal a fractured nation, to find meaning in the sacrifice, and to chart a path toward reconciliation. With a deep sigh, Lincoln turns from the window. His hand rests on the windowsill for a moment longer, as if anchoring himself to the present, to the pain, the gravity, the blood-soaked reality of what this war has become. Behind him, a messenger clears his throat softly. "Mr. President, the cabinet awaits." Lincoln nods, but doesn't move. His mind is still on Gettysburg, on Meade, on the telegrams that spelled victory, wrapped in death. He mutters, more to himself than anyone else, "The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here." Then he stops. No, not yet. Those words aren't ready, but someday they will be. Someday he will stand upon that very field where men like Armistead and Hancock bled not for politics, but for permanence, for the right of a people to remain whole. Someday he will speak, and the world will remember. That is the strange truth of Gettysburg. For all its thunder and fire, for all its deaths and decisions, it doesn't end with a bang. It ends with a silence, the kind that follows heartbreak, the kind that follows failure, the kind that lingers, like smoke, in the chest of a nation. Robert E. Lee, the man who never lost, is no longer unbeaten. The Confederate high tide has crested and is now receding. And yet, there is no peace. Not yet. Not for the soldiers still buried beneath that soil. Not for the families still waiting for letters that will never come. Not for the country still bleeding from the inside out. But something shifted at Gettysburg. Not just the military tide, the moral one. Because for the first time, the South had struck deep and been turned back. The North had held, not just with cannons and bullets, but with belief, and that belief that this fragile, flawed, extraordinary union could survive, would go on to shape what came next. In the next episode, we'll walk the aftermath. We'll follow Lincoln's journey to Gettysburg, not as a conqueror, but as a mourner. And we'll decode the most powerful 2 minutes in American history, the Gettysburg Address. But for now, we end on the field. A field littered with broken muskets and trampled flags, where silence reigns, where ghosts walk, and where a single truth lingers in the soil. No victory is ever without a cost, and no cost is ever truly forgotten. Day 3, Part 4. The cost beyond the count. The battle was over, but the war wasn't. And for the men still breathing on the fields of Gettysburg, there was one haunting truth they could not shake. They had survived what others had not. And that kind of survival doesn't feel like victory. July 4th, 1863, Independence Day. In another world, there might have been parades, fireworks, cheers echoing through city streets. But here, in Gettysburg, there was only rain. Sheets of cold summer rain pelted the blood-stained fields, turning dust into red mud. Water ran in rivulets through the craters where shells had landed. It soaked through tents, through open wounds, through letters still clutched in dead hands. There was no music, no celebration, only the slow, sloshing retreat of the Confederate army. And behind them, the dead, thousands of them, bodies still unburied, faces still turned upward to the sky, frozen in the exact moment their lives ended. Some with eyes open, some with arms raised, some with nothing left of them to identify. A Union soldier wrote home, "It is a strange thing to win a battle and feel no joy. I feel only pity and cold." He wasn't alone. Across the fields, burial teams began their grim task. They carried stretchers made from fence rails and blanket rolls. They moved in silence, save for the occasional gasp when a familiar face was found. Some men wore tags, most didn't, so they searched pockets, belts, rings, a scribbled name in a Bible. Sometimes, they found letters never mailed. One addressed to Mother, written by a 17-year-old from Georgia. Simply read, "Don't worry about me, I'll be back for harvest." He wouldn't. Another from a Union corporal in the 20th Maine ended with, "If you receive this, I have done what I was sent to do. Bury me with my boots on." They did, sometimes. It's easy to talk about Gettysburg in numbers. 51.00 casualties. 3 days, one turning point. But that's not the truth of it. Because history isn't made in statistics. It's made in the dirt, in the sweat, in the moments between cannon blasts, when men decide to keep walking or drop. Let's go back to the Confederate lines. As Lee's army withdraws, many soldiers walk barefoot, not by choice. Their boots were blown off, burned, taken. Some wrap cloth around their feet, others bleed with every step. The wagons creak under the weight of the wounded. Men groan, some beg for water, others beg for morphine. But the worst are the ones who say nothing. They just stare, eyes fixed on something far beyond the trees. Maybe home, maybe heaven, maybe nowhere. In one wagon, a Confederate private writes in his blood-stained journal, "We do not speak. What is there to say? The march is endless. The war is endless. I am endless until I am not." He died the next morning. The journal was found weeks later and published by his sister. Meanwhile, back in town, the civilians of Gettysburg begin to emerge. For 3 days, they had hidden in basements, behind barns, in root cellars. Now, they step outside to find their world unrecognizable. Farms turned into graveyards, churches turned into hospitals, children's bedrooms now filled with the wounded from both north and south. A woman named Fanny Bueller, whose home had become a makeshift infirmary, later recalled, "There was no time for hatred, no time for flags, just arms to hold the dying and hands to write their names." One Confederate soldier, delirious from infection, kept whispering, "Mom, I'm sorry, I didn't want this, I just wanted to be someone." She held his hand until he stopped breathing, and buried him in her garden. She never learned his name. The town of Gettysburg didn't sleep for weeks, because war doesn't pack up when the soldiers leave. It lingers in the shattered barns, the bullet-pocked doors, the children who stopped playing. Doctors worked by candlelight in every home, every church, every stable. Saws echoed down alleyways, the smell of chloroform mixed with the stench of rotten, unwashed bodies. One surgeon, writing to his wife, said, "I have removed 60 arms in 3 days. I remember none of their names, but I remember how they screamed." And yet, amidst the horror, came glimpses of something else. Something human. A Union drummer boy, just 14, was found feeding soup to a wounded Confederate lieutenant. When asked why, he replied, "He ain't shooting me now, so I reckon I shouldn't starve him." That's the kind of logic only children and angels understand. Further south, newspapers in Richmond tried to spin the story. They printed headlines like, "Yankee casualties severe, Southern bravery unmatched." But in the streets, whispers told the truth, the wounded arriving by rail, the empty beds never filled, the long black dresses that filled Sunday church pews. You can't hide 6.00 dead men with ink and optimism. And by the second week of July, the people knew Gettysburg wasn't just a setback, it was the beginning of the end. Back in Washington, the news came in waves. First, that Meade had held the line. Then, that Lee was retreating. Then, nothing. Lincoln paced the floors of the War Department for hours, waiting for one telegram, just one, saying Meade had pursued. That Lee's army had been trapped, crushed, that the war was over. But that telegram never came, because Meade didn't chase him. He held his ground, defended the victory, but let the South slip away. Lincoln, usually calm, reflective, snapped. He wrote a furious letter to Meade. "Never sent." That read, "You had them within your grasp, and you let them go." But Lincoln didn't send it, because Lincoln, more than anyone, understood that victory without mercy is just vengeance in uniform. And America didn't need vengeance. It needed something else, something bigger. That's when an idea began to take root. A single notion, simple, but profound. What if Gettysburg could be more than a battlefield? What if it could become a message? A story, not of death, but of rebirth. And Lincoln, the man who'd written poetry as a boy, who'd quoted Shakespeare from memory, who saw words not as decoration but as destiny, knew he had to go there. He had to speak, not to claim credit, not to declare triumph, but to remind America why it still existed, and why it still mattered. In the weeks that followed, plans were laid for a cemetery, a national cemetery, not just for Union dead, but for the idea of Union itself. The date was set, November 19th, 1863. The invited speaker, Edward Everett, the most famous orator in the country. Lincoln was invited as an afterthought, a footnote, just to say a few appropriate remarks. No one expected what would come next, not even him, but that's a story for another time. And we're almost there. For now, let's go back to the men, to the ones who lived, who limped home, who sat alone on porches with missing limbs and haunted eyes. Some never spoke of Gettysburg again. Others couldn't stop. They became fathers, teachers, senators, drunks. One Confederate private, when asked on his deathbed what he remembered most from the war, didn't mention bullets or generals or flags. He said, "I remember July 4th, the rain, the silence, and the sound of horses stepping through the dead. Because some memories don't fade. They echo. Not all ghosts wear white sheets. Some wear uniforms. Some wear wedding rings. Some wear the blank expression of a man who lived when others didn't." In the years after Gettysburg, the ghosts spread across the country. They walked the dusty roads of Georgia, the frozen fields of Illinois, the quiet hills of Kentucky. They appeared at midnight, in rocking chairs, at supper, when someone reached for a plate that would never be filled again. They showed up in dreams, and in silences that no one dared to break. One Union corporal returned to Ohio and couldn't look his fiancée in the eye. He wrote in his journal, "She sees the man who lived. I see the men who didn't. They broke off the engagement. He never married. and never spoke of Gettysburg again, except once, at a funeral, when someone asked what he'd seen. He said, simply, more than God intended. In Mississippi, a young boy watched his older brother limp home, minus one arm. Plus a 1,000-yard stare. He didn't ask what happened, but the brother, unprompted, told him, if you ever get the urge to be brave, wait 5 minutes. It usually passes. Then he went inside and never spoke of it again. Years later, that little boy would become a teacher, and he would teach his students about the Constitution and courage and war, but never about Gettysburg, because some battles belong only to the ones who fought them. And what about the South? What happened to the dream of Lee's brilliant gamble, to the vision of victory on northern soil? It crumbled, not all at once, but slowly, like a flag left too long in the rain. The newspapers grew quieter, the speeches less certain, the food more scarce, but worse than the loss was the doubt. What if Gettysburg hadn't been noble? What if it had been a mistake? What if Lee, the untouchable, the unstoppable, had been wrong? For a region built on pride and myth, that was the unkindest wound of all. And yet, life went on. The crops were planted, the children grew, the letters stopped arriving, and the name Gettysburg began to carry weight. Not just military weight, but moral weight. A symbol, a scar, a warning, a promise. Something terrible had happened there, and something necessary, and the country had changed, even if it didn't know it yet. Meanwhile, Abraham Lincoln kept that unsent letter to General Meade, folded, tucked away in a drawer. And instead, he focused on something else, what the men had fought for. Not territory, not revenge, but meaning, the idea of a union, one that could outlive its sins, one that could rise, not because it was perfect, but because it refused to die. That's why, when November 19th came, Lincoln didn't arrive in Gettysburg to take credit. He arrived to consecrate, not just a cemetery, but a story, one he would tell in just 272 words. Words that would echo longer than any cannon blast, travel further than any charge. Words that would define America not by who it had been, but by who it could still become. When Lincoln arrived in Gettysburg, he wasn't met with trumpets or fanfare. He rode in quietly, through streets still marked with blood. Locals peeked from windows, children stood in silence, and soldiers, even those still limping, stood as straight as their wounds allowed. Because they all knew, this wasn't just a speech, it was a reckoning. Lincoln spent the night before the ceremony in a simple house near the square. He barely slept, not because he was nervous, but because he felt the weight of something he couldn't yet name. At one point, his aide asked if he needed more time to prepare his remarks. Lincoln replied, "No, the world will not remember what I say here." Irony, of course, is history's favorite joke, because what he wrote next, in the quiet flicker of gaslight, on the back of an envelope, would become immortal. But we'll get to that. First, let's return to the battlefield. By November, the grass had begun to grow back, but the ground still felt wrong. Heavy, the kind of heavy that isn't about weight, but memory. People spoke softer near the ridge. Horses stepped slower. Even the wind seemed reluctant to cross the open field. Some called it sacred ground, not because of what happened there, but because of what remained. The ceremony was modest. Thousands gathered, families clutching black armbands, veterans leaning on canes, widows holding folded flags. Edward Everett, the honored speaker, rose and delivered a masterclass. 2 hours of oratory, references to Thermopylae, to Cicero, to the Bible. People clapped, and then Lincoln stood, tall, gaunt, eyes shadowed by grief and conviction. He looked out over the crowd, and then over the cemetery, and then he began. No theatrics, no flourish, just truth. 74 years ago. He spoke for 2 minutes, 272 words. No battle names, no enemy slander, no mention of Lee or Meade or Pickett or victory. Only one idea, that the men who died there had done something the rest of the country now had to live up to. That democracy, real, flawed, messy democracy, had been tested and must not perish. When he finished, there was silence, then light applause. One newspaper said it was dull and disappointing. Another called it the fewest appropriate remarks ever spoken. But Edward Everett, the great orator of the day, approached Lincoln and said, "Mr. President, you said in 2 minutes what I could not in 2 hours." Lincoln just nodded. He wasn't there to be remembered. He was there to remind. And so, we arrive at the end of day 3, not with gunfire, but with a whisper, a vow, a sentence that still ripples through every American generation. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. What began as a gamble by a brilliant general, ended as a prayer from a grieving president. And that's the twist, that's the legacy. Gettysburg wasn't just a turning point of war. It was the rebirth of what America believed itself to be. And that idea, once whispered across the graves of 51.00 men, still echoes, still stands, still waits for us to be worthy of it. Day 3, Part 5, the aftershock. The guns had fallen silent, but no one felt peace. Not in Gettysburg, not in Richmond, not in Washington, because the battle had ended, but the aftershock had just begun. On paper, it was a Union victory. Strategically, tactically, symbolically, Lee had invaded the North. Lee had failed. Lee was retreating. But to many in the Union High Command, the celebration felt hollow, because there was one question no one could stop asking. Why didn't Meade pursue? General George Meade, just days into his command, had done what no Union general before him had accomplished. He'd held the line against Lee. He'd fought for 3 days, coordinated dozens of divisions, and broken the myth of Confederate invincibility. But when Lee's army began to slip away southward, wounded, exhausted, exposed, Meade let them go. No bayonet pursuit, no thunderous chase, just cautious observation. President Lincoln, in Washington, was stunned. He had read the reports. He had seen the casualty lists. He knew that if the Union Army moved quickly, they could pin Lee against the Potomac River, swollen by summer rain. Uncrossable for days, Lee's army, trapped and limping, might have surrendered, and that might have ended the war in 1863. Might have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Might have changed everything. Lincoln wrote a letter to Meade, a letter he never sent. But the words are still with us. My dear General, I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. You had him within your grasp, and you let him go. And then, in perhaps the most painful sentence of Lincoln's presidency, now he is free to go where he pleases. He will give us no peace. But can we blame Meade? Let's rewind the clock back to July 4th, 1863. His army had just fought a brutal 3-day battle. He had over 23.00 casualties. His supply lines were strained. The rain was relentless. His men were exhausted, his horses dying, and the fields ahead, unfamiliar, forested, and flooded. To chase Lee into the unknown could have turned a hard-earned victory into disaster. Meade made the safe call, and history has debated him ever since. But here's the twist. While the North asked, why didn't we chase them? The South asked something darker. Can we ever win again? In Richmond, the mood was not angry. It was shaken. Lee had been untouchable. He had humiliated Union generals on their own soil. He had become the South Smith, its marble god. And now, he was just a man who had gambled and lost, a man whose army had been turned back, a man who said, in his own words, "It is all my fault." For many in the Confederacy, Gettysburg wasn't just a defeat. It was a revelation that victory might not be inevitable, that invincible Lee might not be invincible, that God might no longer be on their side. And that shift, that crack in the myth, was the true beginning of the end. For Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, Gettysburg was more than a loss. It was a strategic nightmare. He had staked political capital on Lee's campaign, sent reinforcements northward, thinned other fronts, and promised the world that Southern courage would triumph once more. But now, diplomats in Britain and France stopped returning his calls. Southern newspapers, once euphoric, turned defensive. The Richmond Examiner wrote, Gettysburg was no rout, merely a withdrawal under pressure. But no one believed it. Not in Richmond, not in Charleston, not in the smoke-filled halls of European chancelleries, not even in the kitchens where Southern mothers folded uniforms too small for the next son. The South didn't just lose ground, it lost momentum, and momentum, in war, is more valuable than gold. Meanwhile, in the North, a different transformation began. At first, disbelief, then relief, and then something strange. Resolve. The Battle of Gettysburg didn't make the North feel triumphant. It made him feel tested. And somehow, they'd passed. In letters home, soldiers wrote not of glory, but of gravity. One private in the 11th Pennsylvania wrote, We stood, we bled, but we did not break. I no longer fight to punish the South. I fight so that my children will not have to fight this war again. And in Boston, a mother whose eldest son had died at Cemetery Ridge wrote a letter to Lincoln. It read, Sir, you did not know my boy, but he believed in you. He died facing the enemy, never turning once. Please make it mean something. Lincoln kept that letter in his desk for weeks. He never replied, but he read it again and again and again. And in that quiet shift, from grief to purpose, America began to change. You could feel it in the pulpits. You could see it in the editorials. You could hear it in the songs sung at night, around campfires, by soldiers too young to shave. We'll rally round the flag. Boys, we'll rally once again. There was pain, yes, there was exhaustion, but under it all, for the first time in a long time, there was also belief, and that's what Gettysburg really did. It didn't end the war. It didn't kill the Confederacy, but it planted a seed, a dangerous seed, because for the South, it meant time was running out, and for the North, it meant time was finally on their side. That was the aftershock, not felt in one day, not written in telegrams, but rippling, slow, invisible, through every heart in America. And one final twist, while both armies buried the dead, while newspapers argued over victory and blame, a quiet rumor began to spread. Whispers, hushed voices in corridors and courtrooms. He's changing. Lincoln's not the same. There's something different in his eyes. And they were right, because Gettysburg didn't just change the course of war. It changed the man leading it. And that man, he was about to change everything. The Abraham Lincoln who stood at Gettysburg in November 1863 was not the same man who'd entered office 2 years prior. Back then, he was cautious, pragmatic, willing to let slavery survive if it meant preserving the Union. But Gettysburg cracked something open. It showed him the soul of the nation, torn and trembling. But still there, it made him believe, not just in the Constitution, but in the promise behind it. Freedom, equality, the idea that all men are created equal, wasn't just a sentence in parchment, but a torch passed through fire. In the days after Gettysburg, Lincoln's tone sharpened, his speeches became bolder, his gaze steadier. He pushed for the Emancipation Proclamation not as strategy, but as necessity. A house divided against itself cannot stand. He had once warned, now he meant it. He didn't want to just win a war. He wanted to win a future. And Gettysburg had shown him. The cost of hesitation was blood. Back in the camps, Union soldiers noticed the shift. One wrote, "It is as if Father Abraham has fire in him now. He walks slower, speaks less, but when he does, it is scripture." And in the South, they noticed too. For every mile Lee retreated, Lincoln advanced, not with cannons, but with conviction. And nothing is more dangerous than a leader who has learned what his country is truly fighting for. And yet, there was still darkness. The war was not over. In fact, some of its bloodiest chapters were yet to be written. Chickamauga, Cold Harbor, the wilderness. But after Gettysburg, the North no longer fought just to survive. They fought to finish, to redeem, to become. That shift, intangible, invisible, unstoppable, was the real victory of Gettysburg. Because some battles are not won by bullets or bodies. They are won when a people, broken and bloodied, choose to keep walking, not because they are strong, but because they refuse to surrender their better angels. So now, the stage is set. The armies will clash again. The blood will flow again. But this time, the Union will carry something they did not have before. Faith, not in politicians, not in generals, but in each other, and in an unfinished idea. That from the dead shall rise a nation, newly defined, forever changed. Day 3, Part 6. Legacy. History doesn't echo in dates. It echoes in consequences. And long after the last musket fell silent at Gettysburg, its shockwaves kept rippling through time, through culture, through memory, because some battles never end. They just change form. In the days and months after Gettysburg, families waited for letters, for news, for bones. Some received coffins, others received nothing at all. No name, no marker, no goodbye, only a silence that stretched on for years. And in that silence, a question: did it matter? Did their sons, fathers, brothers, who died on foreign Pennsylvania soil, change anything? Did their sacrifice buy more than time? Or was it just loss? Lincoln believed it mattered. So did the mothers who walked barefoot to the cemetery. So did the children who remembered that their fathers never came home from Gettysburg. But belief isn't legacy. Legacy has to be built. And that's where America faced its greatest challenge. Not in defeating the South, but in becoming something worthy of its own dead. Because Gettysburg gave the Union something priceless, but also dangerous: moral clarity. And moral clarity can turn righteous or vengeful. Healing wasn't inevitable. In fact, the years after Gettysburg saw some of the bloodiest political wars in American history. Reconstruction, assassination, Jim Crow, lynchings. Freedom had been proclaimed, but justice, that would take another century. So what did Gettysburg truly leave behind? Not closure, not peace, but a mirror, a battlefield-sized reflection of who America was, and who it still might become. A mirror that asked, if 51.00 men died for a country they believed could be better, what are you doing with that inheritance? That's the question that echoes through every civil rights march, every protest song, every courtroom oath that begins with, "I swear to tell the truth." It's what haunts presidents when they send troops to foreign soil. It's what whispers through every political debate about what America stands for. Because the truth is, America stands on Gettysburg, still, and maybe that's the point. Maybe Gettysburg was never meant to give answers. Maybe it was meant to give us a burden. To remember, to wrestle, to carry, the burden of possibility, the burden of sacrifice, the burden of asking, again and again, are we living lives worthy of the dead? There's a strange thing about battlefields. Years pass, grass grows, children play, selfies get taken where bayonets once clashed. And yet, the ground remembers. Not literally, not mystically, but viscerally. You walk the ridge at Cemetery Hill, stand where Pickett's men were cut down, or look out from Little Round Top as the wind whistles through the grass. And suddenly, silence feels loud, the past feels present, and history feels personal. Gettysburg is that rare kind of place. It doesn't just record the story. It asks you if you understand it. It asks, what would you have done? Would you have stood with Chamberlain at the edge of the Union line? Out of bullets but not out of courage? Would you have marched across that open field, knowing full well that death was waiting? Would you have begged Lee to call off the charge? Or would you have believed, like so many did, that duty was more sacred than survival? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the heartbeat of legacy. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to carry forward. And yet, not all legacies are carried well. Let's be honest, Gettysburg was buried. more than once, under romantic lies, under lost cause myths, under statues and textbooks that turned it into something it wasn't. A noble draw, a brother against brother fable, a tragedy without villains. But that's not what Gettysburg was. It was a rebuke, a clash of moral futures, a test, and not everyone passed. After the war, the battlefield was preserved, a national cemetery was built, Lincoln's words were etched in granite, tours began, monuments rose, veterans returned, old and limping, to walk the grounds one last time. And people asked, how should we remember this? That question haunted the nation through the Gilded Age, the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights Movement, and into the 21st century. Each generation looked at Gettysburg and saw something different. For some, it was sacrifice. For others, failure. For some, glory. For others, guilt. That's the thing about legacy. It's not permanent. It's not marble. It's a story, and stories evolve. But here's the twist. The more America changes, the more Gettysburg stays the same. It's still a place where the best and worst of the country met, where one idea died and another took its first breath. It's still there, waiting, not as a grave, but as a mirror. In 1913, 50 years after the battle, something impossible happened. Thousands of Civil War veterans returned to Gettysburg, Union and Confederate, old, frail. Many had to be helped off trains, carried in wheelchairs. Some hadn't walked since they left this field in 1863. But they came, and on the anniversary of Pickett's Charge, they reenacted it, not with rifles, with handshakes. Old Confederates walked across the same open field. Old Union soldiers stood waiting, and instead of bullets, they opened their arms. They embraced, they wept, they whispered names of friends long gone. One Confederate sergeant said, "I never thought I'd live to see the day we crossed that field." And didn't die. It was called the Great Reunion. But let's be honest, it wasn't closure, because history isn't healed in a single hug. It was something else, a reminder that the past doesn't go away. It waits and asks, what have you learned? During World War I, soldiers marched off to Europe carrying copies of the Gettysburg Address. In World War II, President Roosevelt read it aloud on national radio. After Selma, Martin Luther King Jr. quoted it in a sermon about unfinished business. After 9/11, schoolchildren recited it at memorials. Barack Obama spoke of it when he accepted his nomination. Even today, presidents make pilgrimage to the site, not because they want to, but because they have to. It's where the compass resets. It's where the country remembers what it was meant to be. Not perfect, but worth fighting for. And sometimes, the most profound reminders come from the quietest voices. In 2019, a high schooler from California, whose family had never visited Pennsylvania, wrote a college application essay about Gettysburg. She had read the address in class, and it hit her like lightning. She wrote, "I used to think America was a place. Now I think it's a question. Gettysburg makes me want to be part of the answer." She got into every school she applied to, because some truths, they cut through time. That's why Gettysburg matters, not because of muskets or maneuvers, but because somewhere on that field, every American, at some point, has to decide what they stand for, and if they'll stand at all. So now we return to that field, not as soldiers, not as historians, but as inheritors. We walk among the stones, some with names, some without. We read the numbers, the dates, the ages, 17, 21, 33, and we ask ourselves, what did they see when they looked at this country and decided it was worth dying for? They saw something unfinished, a project, an idea, not perfect, not clean, but possible. And maybe that's what legacy really is. Not a monument, not a myth, but a challenge, a whisper across time that says, we did our part, now you do yours. Gettysburg is not just a chapter in a history book. It's not a battlefield frozen in time. It is a question etched into the bones of a nation. It asks, will you be brave when it's your turn to stand? Will you lead, even when you're unsure? Will you believe, even when it hurts? And most of all, will you live a life worthy of the sacrifice? That's where we end this story. Not with triumph, not with despair, but with a hand on the wall. Like that Confederate soldier who made it to the Union line and whispered, "I've done my duty. Now the question is, have we? Have you?" Because Gettysburg still echoes, still calls, still waits for the answer. Character Psychology, Part 1/6, The Shadow Behind the Legend. The cannons had gone silent. The screaming had faded. All that remained was wind. And Robert E. Lee, still astride his gray horse, traveler, rode slowly along what was left of his army. They did not cheer. They did not salute. They stared, hollow-eyed, shell-shocked, broken. Some men looked away. Some wept. Some whispered prayers between bloodied lips. Lee tipped his hat to every unit. He said nothing, because what do you say to men who followed you into fire and came back fewer than they left? Finally, he spoke to a colonel whose brigade had been reduced from 1.200 to less than 300. Lee dismounted, looked the man in the eye, and said softly, "It is all my fault." The words hit harder than any Union shell. That moment, quiet, unrecorded by photographers or newspapers, was the turning point inside the war. Not on maps, but in minds. Because the invincible had admitted defeat. Not just defeat in battle, but defeat in judgment. And Lee, the man revered as almost divine by the Southern public, was now painfully, visibly human. Some aides wept, others averted their eyes. But Lee stood tall. He had lost the battle, but not his dignity. At least, not yet. But the real collapse, it wasn't in troop numbers. It was within. The moment he dismounted, the weight hit him. Not of bodies, but of belief. He had believed too deeply in honor, in tactics, in destiny, and it had led 51.00 men into a slaughterhouse. All because of him. In the quiet of his tent that night, Lee didn't eat. He sat, still in uniform, still with boots on. Maps lay scattered across the table, but he didn't see them. His eyes were distant, not fixed on Gettysburg, but on what might have been. What if he'd listened to Longstreet? What if he'd abandoned the frontal assault? What if he'd waited one more day and let the Union come to him? But what ifs don't bring men back. They only torment the living. And Lee knew that torment well. He reached for a pen, intending to draft a message to Richmond. But he couldn't. What words could explain this? What sentence could justify 6.00 dead in a single hour? His hand trembled. So instead, he closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for strength, to carry the shame outside. His soldiers whispered stories. Some defended him. It wasn't Lee's fault. The scouts failed him. The terrain tricked him. Others were quieter. I saw him. He looked bold, like the war had aged him 10 years in one day. And one veteran, just 19, said, "I still love him, but now I know he's not God." And that might have been the greatest blow of all. Not the loss of a hill, not the retreat, but the collapse of myth. Because Lee had never asked to be worshipped. But once worship begins, no human survives it. Yet even as his own faith cracked, Lee did something few leaders ever do. He took the blame, fully, publicly, repeatedly, when newspapers in Richmond tried to spin the defeat as a strategic withdrawal. Lee wrote directly to Jefferson Davis, "No, do not mislead the people. The fault is mine." It was brutal, unfiltered, and utterly, disarmingly honest. But was it enough? Could accountability alone mend the shattered trust? Could one man's humility erase the cost? Those were questions even Lee couldn't answer. All he knew was, his army had followed him to hell, and he had not brought them back home. Character Psychology, Part 2/6, The Man WHO Knows Forward. He saw it coming, long before the cannonade, long before the drums, long before the bugles sang men into oblivion. James Longstreet, the old warhorse, saw the disaster in his mind's eye. And he begged, not once, not twice, but again and again, "General Lee, don't order the charge." But Lee, exhausted, desperate, clinging to one last hope, didn't listen. And so Longstreet obeyed, reluctantly, silently, and with a heart full of dread. There's a unique kind of grief. When you follow orders you know will kill your men. It's not fear, it's not regret, it's complicity, and Longstreet bore it like lead in his lungs. When the order was finally given, to lodge Pickett's division across the open field, Longstreet didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply nodded, and later said, "I could not speak. I could only bow in silence and pass along the order, because my heart was too full." Too full of what? Of loyalty, of helplessness, of prophecy. Longstreet watched them line up. Men he had eaten with, marched with, laughed with, now reduced to rows on a chessboard. He wanted to scream, but he didn't, because by that point, the war had already stolen too many voices. And then they went, over 12,000 men, marching across a mile of open field, into a line of Union artillery that could see them like ducks in a pond. Longstreet didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't look away, because if they were going to die, he would not dishonor them by looking elsewhere. He would bear witness. Afterward, when the field was red and smoking and eerily silent, he walked the length of the Confederate line. A captain approached him, tears in his beard, blood on his sleeves. "General, why? Why did we do it?" Longstreet had no answer, none that would comfort, none that would justify. So he just said, "Because war is a monster that even generals can't always leash." Later that night, Lee summoned him. The two sat alone in a candle-lit tent. Lee looked broken, but Longstreet, he looked hollow, as if something had left him permanently. "You were right," Lee whispered. Longstreet didn't reply. He just nodded, not with pride, but with pain, because sometimes being right is the worst outcome of all. In the years after Gettysburg, Longstreet would carry this ghost. He didn't talk about it, didn't write letters about it, but it followed him to every reunion, every funeral, every time someone said, "Pickett's Charge," like it was just a phrase and not a graveyard. And in a cruel twist of history, he paid a second price, because he had opposed the charge, because he had dared to doubt Lee. Southern historians would later blame him for the defeat. They rewrote the story. Longstreet delayed the assault. He didn't commit fully. He sabotaged the plan. All of it lies, but powerful ones, because even truth can be drowned by myth. Longstreet spent decades defending himself, not out of vanity, but out of loyalty to his men. "I do not mind what they say of me," he once said, "but I cannot let them say that my boys died for no reason." Near the end of his life, he returned to Gettysburg. He stood near the stone wall where his men had been butchered. A journalist asked what he felt. Standing there again, Longstreet said nothing at first. Then simply, "I told him, God help me, I told him." And that was it. No anger, no self-pity, just a whisper carried by wind across a battlefield that never forgot. Psychology of Character, Part 3/6, Professor on Dead Hill. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be at Bowdoin College, teaching Greek, debating Plato, quoting Kant to bored undergrads, not standing on a rock-strewn hill, holding a sword, watching the Confederate line move like a gray tide toward his position. Little Round Top was just that, a little hill, but that day, it became the hinge of the Union flank. If it fell, the entire Union line could be rolled up like a carpet. So Chamberlain, barely trained, barely equipped, and down to his last bullets, was told one thing: hold the left at all costs. And he did, but it cost him. The first charge came fast. Bullets screamed. Smoke choked the trees. Chamberlain's men, the 20th Maine, fired, reloaded, fired again, then again, then again. And when they reached for more cartridges, there were none. They were out, every last round, and the Confederates were coming again. At that moment, Chamberlain had a choice: fall back, surrender, or something unthinkable. He drew his sword, turned to his men, and shouted, "Fix bayonets and charge." No ammunition, no backup, just will, just steel, just the raw defiance of men who refused to let the line break. They charged downhill, screaming like banshees, and the Confederates, stunned, broke ranks. Little Round Top was saved, not by firepower, but by one man's decision to charge into the unknown. That's the legend. But the truth, it cost Chamberlain something inside. That night, after the cheers faded and the wounded were dragged down the hill, Chamberlain sat alone, hands shaking, not from fatigue, from grief. He had seen men, boys, really, die by his orders. And something in him cracked. Not like glass, more like stone, worn smooth by too many names whispered in the dark. Later, as prisoners were brought through the Union lines, he saw a Confederate soldier crawl, literally crawl, through a pile of corpses to reach him. The man looked up, blood on his cheek, tears in his eyes, and said, "Sir, I surrender." And Chamberlain broke. He dropped to his knees and wept, because he didn't hate this man. He didn't want him dead. He didn't even want the war. He just wanted it to stop. For months afterward, Chamberlain struggled. He wrote in his diary, "Victory is a poor salve for the loss of the innocent." He had nightmares, flashbacks, moments when the world blurred into smoke and screams. And when he returned to Maine after the war, he couldn't walk into a lecture hall without seeing the faces of the boys he'd buried. But he kept going. He became governor. He raised a family. He gave speeches. He smiled in photographs. But the hill never left him. It was inside him, every step, every night, when he was asked late in life what it felt like to win Gettysburg. He paused, then said, "I did not win anything. I simply held a place until death came too close and passed us by." That was his victory. That was his wound. And he carried both together until the day he died. Character Psychology, Part 4/6, When Friends Become Enemies. There's a photo, faded, sepia-toned. It shows two men, arms around each other, smiling, officers, brothers in spirit. One would lead Union troops at Gettysburg. The other would charge him. Winfield Scott Hancock and Lewis Armistead. Friends, comrades, now opponents. Because war doesn't just divide states, it divides hearts. Before the war, they had dined together, drank together, prayed together. They had stood side by side at the funeral of another friend. Armistead had even given Hancock a Bible with an inscription, "May God protect you always, my brother in arms." And then came secession. Armistead, a Virginian, chose the South. Hancock stayed with the Union. Neither cursed the other, but neither hesitated either, because in 1861, friendship became secondary to loyalty, and loyalty would soon lead to Gettysburg. On July 3rd, Armistead stood with Pickett's men, sword drawn, hat lifted high on his blade, the signal to move. Ahead of him, across a mile of open field, behind a stone wall, was Hancock, his friend, his mirror, and perhaps his fate. As the charge began, Armistead moved forward, not with bloodlust, not with fear, but with a strange, solemn calm. He shouted, "Remember your wives, your mothers, your sweethearts." Forward, shells burst around him. Men fell like wheat in a scythe. But Armistead kept going. He reached the Union wall, one of the few to do so. Placed his hand on the stone, drew his sword, and then a shot rang out, then another. He stumbled, dropped to his knees, blood soaked through his uniform. His hat fell, so did he. Union soldiers rushed toward him, expecting resistance. Instead, they found a dying man. He looked up at them, eyes wide, skin pale, voice ragged. "Tell General Hancock, I have done my duty." Then he fell back, breathing shallow, hands trembling, whispering names of friends, of home, of before. They carried him to a field hospital. He never regained full consciousness, but a chaplain sat beside him as he slipped away. He did not die angry. The chaplain wrote later, he died remembering. When Hancock was told, he was already wounded, shot while commanding the center. Lying in his own tent, pale from blood loss, he whispered, "Armistead." And when they nodded, when they told him his friend had fallen just yards away, he closed his eyes and said nothing for a long, long time. Because what words are there when war kills the part of you that remembered peace? Years later, the story would be told again and again, sometimes embellished, sometimes doubted, but always haunting, because in a battle filled with thunder and fire and steel, the quietest words became the loudest. Tell Hancock, I have done my duty. Not, I regret. Not, I hate. Just duty. That was all that was left. And somehow, that made it worse. Armistead's grave lies far from Gettysburg, but every year, someone still places flowers on it. No card, no name, just a gesture from one human to another, who died doing what he thought was right, even if it meant dying against someone he loved. Psychology of Character, Part 5/6, Voices from the Unknown. History rarely remembers the quiet ones. It records the generals, the speeches, the bayonet charges and battlefield maps. But it forgets the boy who wrote one last letter by candlelight. The farmhand who tucked a photo of his mother in his coat pocket. The shoemaker who signed up not out of patriotism, but because the recruiter promised him shoes. In Gettysburg, over 51,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing. Of those, thousands had no names recovered, no unit properly assigned, no family ever notified. They were simply gone. And yet, they were the ones who held the line, who loaded the cannon, who charged the wall, who screamed, prayed, bled, and died for a cause most of them couldn't fully define. One Union private, age 17, wrote to his sister the night before the charge, "If I do not return, plant lilies by the window for me. Tell father I didn't run. Tell mother I died warm." Thinking of her hands, his body was never found. Only the letter survived, folded inside his Bible, stained by something that might have been blood or tears. On the Confederate side, a corporal from Georgia was heard reciting Psalm chapter 23 as he marched into the open field. He wasn't a religious man, but in those last moments, he clung to the words, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." He never finished the verse. A shell landed near his position. All that remained was a boot, charred at the edge. They were not officers. They gave no orders, but they paid the price of every decision made above them. And their legacy is buried, not just in graves, but in silence, in the empty seat at a family table, the wedding that never happened, the child never born. War doesn't just kill the body, it murders potential, and Gettysburg was a graveyard of what might have been. One Union sergeant survived the entire 3 days. He lived into his 80s. When asked what he remembered most, he didn't mention glory. He said, "The sound, not of battle, but of breathing." Just before the charge, thousands of us, waiting, breathing, pause, and then nothing. Another soldier, Confederate, wounded but alive, wrote a poem before his arm was amputated. It was never published, found decades later in a trunk at a family farm. Just one stanza. "I held the hand of a Yankee boy as he bled out near my feet. We shared no name, no word, no God, but his tears, they tasted sweet." That was Gettysburg, not North versus South, but boy versus boy, and loss versus loss. These men had no monuments, no statues, just withered stones, marked unknown. And perhaps that's fitting, because in death, they were finally the same. No more blue, no more gray, only silence, and the hope that someone, someday, would remember not just what they died for, but who they were. Character Psychology, Part 6/6, Lincoln and the tears in the dark. He read every name, every report, every casualty list that came in from Gettysburg, and when the numbers passed 50.000, Abraham Lincoln closed the file and wept, not in front of his cabinet, not on a podium, alone, in a dimly lit room of the White House, where the floor creaked and the shadows didn't lie. He wasn't supposed to feel this much. Presidents aren't allowed to, but Lincoln wasn't just a president. He was a father, a poet, a man who'd buried one child, and feared he was burying an entire generation. He knew Gettysburg was a turning point, but that didn't comfort him, because what had turned was the cost. Before, the war was about strategy. Now, it was about sacrifice, not numbers, but names, not politics, but pain. He walked the halls at night, barefoot, pacing. Aides reported hearing him mutter to himself, "What have we become? How can a nation be saved if it doesn't know what it is?" These weren't rhetorical questions. They were wounds, questions that bled, and Lincoln, though tall, though brilliant, though idolized, was still a man trying to stitch together a country torn in two. When the invitation came to speak at the cemetery being built in Gettysburg, Lincoln didn't smile. He nodded, said only, "It is fitting," then added, "But I do not know what to say." That was the truth. He wasn't coming to rally. He was coming to grieve. He didn't want applause. He wanted meaning. In the days before the speech, he sat in silence for hours, tossed pages in the fire, wrote lines in the margin of old books, asked himself again and again, "What do I owe the dead?" And then, one night, he found the answer, not in law, not in history, but in faith, not religious, but human, a faith in government of the people, by the people, for the people. A sentence so simple, so honest, it felt like truth poured from the marrow of America itself. And so, on November 19th, 1863, Abraham Lincoln stood on a wooden platform in Gettysburg, not as a president, but as a mourner. He looked over the crowd, the graves behind him, the flags at half-mast, and he spoke 272 words, no longer than a modern tweet storm. But in that brevity was eternity. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. He wasn't elevating the dead, he was lowering himself. He was telling the country, we owe them, all of them, not just with memory, but with purpose. He ended not with policy, but with a promise that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, a rebirth, a resurrection, from ashes, from blood, from Gettysburg. When he finished, there was polite applause, nothing wild, nothing viral. Some newspapers mocked him, others ignored the speech entirely. But one man, Edward Everett, the famed orator who spoke before Lincoln, came to him afterward and said, "Mr. President, you said more in 2 minutes than I did in 2 hours." And he was right, because some truths don't need flourish. They just need faith. And so Lincoln rode back to Washington, silent, tired, but changed, because Gettysburg hadn't just rewritten history. It had rewritten him, and through him, it had rewritten America. Fox series. That's where the battle ends. Not on the ridge, not at the wall, not in the grave, but in the hearts of those who live after. Gettysburg isn't just where America nearly died. It's where America was born again. Not perfect, not clean, but real. And that's the legacy, not just of Lincoln, not just of Lee or Chamberlain or Armistead, but of every soul, known and unknown, who dared to believe that a broken country could still find its soul. And that's the legacy of Gettysburg, of America, of all of us, not just soldiers, not just names on monuments, but voices, buried beneath the soil, yet still whispering. We walk among the stones, some with names, some with only numbers, some just a faint impression of who once lived and died for something larger than themselves. They're still here, in the ground, in the air, in the bloodline of a nation built not on perfection, but on the struggle to become worthy of freedom. In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Forms change, but spirit lives on. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. The battle is over, but the silence, that's where meaning begins. When the smoke fades, when the guns are silent, when the cheers die, what remains is choice. The choice to forget, or to remember, to repeat the past, or to rise from it. Because Gettysburg is not a destination. It is a threshold, a place where a nation stood between darkness and dawn, and whispered, "Let us try again." But now, the battlefield is silent, and the story, it's no longer just ours to tell. It's yours to continue. Was Gettysburg Lee's greatest mistake, or destiny in disguise? Was it glory or grief? You decide. Comment, wilted flower, if you believe Gettysburg was a tragedy more than a triumph. Or drop Lincoln, if you want us to return to this field, not with muskets, but with words that still echo 160 years later. Some words die, some endure, some reshape the world. Narrator, in hip can lie. Man me, day do am. And of course, hit that subscribe button, because history doesn't end with a gunshot. It ends when we stop listening. And around here, we're just getting started.